Hi, Misha here, and while we're on vacation, Fox and I, it's time for another ridiculous deep dive, and one that a few of you have requested, and one that I've wanted to do anyway. Last time, we looked at the Japanese, and for those who commented, I made you a deal. Talk about that in just a minute. But today, I'm going to go a little further down the line, in the old safe room, and talk about the SKS, Simonov's self-loading carbine. It's over in this corner. You can also tell it's starting to thunder and lightning outside, which is the perfect time to do a long video while we're all stuck in. So what we're going to do, we're going to go through it all as usual. And I will come back here and give some kind of comments and stories and side notes. And as always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support us, there is a link to Patreon as always in the description. So with that, let's get to it. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you that for the next ridiculous deep dive video, you can go over and vote on Patreon. There's a poll up, so any Patreon supporter can say, would you like it to be on the FAL, AL1A1, or the AR-10, AR-15? Or, I also made a third option of neither, I'm tired of both, something else. So, kind of a wild card thing. This one, of course, was already kind of being planned before I did that. Obviously, I'm recording it before Fox and I went on vacation on holiday, but I'm publishing it during that time, so you guys have something new. Hope you enjoyed the Patreon, and therein again over the Patreon Q&A. Therein again over on Patreon, there's a extended version that has quite a few scenes that we had to cut for YouTube reasons, so check that out. But anyway, focusing on the SKS, we have to begin, not at the beginning, but before the beginning, because we have two paths. When I was young, a lot of people in the 90s mixed up the AK-47, the AK, the Kalashnikov, and the SKS, SKS-45, the Simonov. That's because on paper, they might seem quite similar, firing the same cartridge, from the same country, not a whole lot different in size, but these two guns really illustrate the two separate paths, rifle and submachine gun. And Russia, in a lot of ways, was a pioneer in both. So, which one should we start with? Let's first talk about the submachine gun. The subgun became very iconic for World War II. America's Thompson, Britain's Sten gun, Germany's MP40, and Russia actually was the largest user of SMGs during that war, producing upwards of 10 million all told, all types, and using even more than that because they received quite a few Lend-Lease guns, including Thompsons from America and others. But like a lot of nations before the war, they really didn't see the purpose of the gun. It hadn't been demonstrated yet. It was a new concept, the submachine gun. Obviously, it came in at the tail end of World War I, but really only Germany and Italy, made them, and even those saw relatively limited use. And throughout the 1930s, different nations, Russia included, produced them in small numbers. They had their PPD series, PPD 34, 38, and 40. And the 40 was getting closer, firing the 7.62 by 25 Tokarev round. Very good candidate for a submachine gun. And that's where we get the PPSH 41 here. You see in late 1930s, early 1940, Georgy Shpagin thought that he could make a submachine gun that was more reliable, simpler, easier to mass produce than what had come before. And he used quite a new technology, stamped steel. Now, this wasn't stamped steel like we think of it today. This is more like sheet steel. Very thick, very bulky, very basic bends. Nevertheless, his gun would use some. It would be prototyped in 1940, and it would undergo testing at the end of that year, and it was recommended for adoption, and it would take time to set up production in 1941, because, again, the stamping, the steel technology was quite advanced for Russia. Also advanced for the PPSH-41, chromeline bore. The original gun had a 10.5-inch barrel. This one's obviously extended out for legal reasons. It also featured a very basic, but actually quite effective muzzle brake, drum magazine, fixed wood stock, simple rear sight, easy to use, easy to construct. And they were not going at a leisurely pace, but they weren't in a huge hurry to get this in the field. They were taking their time setting things up, testing it, getting it ready to go. Then, of course, June 1941, what I call, oh shit, Germans. During its darkest days, Britain turned to the Sten gun to equip as many people as quickly as possible, making every man a machine gunner. And Russia would end up doing much the same. Luckily, the PPSH-41 was just ready in time, and it was very affordable to produce. It wasn't terribly resource demanding, and it could be produced on relatively basic tooling, and it didn't require a lot of skilled labor to build it. Yet it had a lot of good features for its day and time. Starting off with the drum mag, later it would get a stick mag. It had adequate sights, that chromeline barrel, and that long barrel combined with the muzzle brake and the cartridge meant it was actually very good. And this really became the star of the show in 1942, and it started to really hit the front lines. And along with tanks, platoons, even larger groups of men armed with these could kind of come behind and mop up. And it really became something special. It made its place, and it really proved this submachine gun concept for Russians. And of course, I have to give it a nod to Finland and its KP-31 Suomi, which Russia went up against during the Winter War, and it would greatly influence the PPD-40 and the PPSH-41. But production would continue at multiple factories and sub-factories throughout the war. At the end of the war, they would have built over 5 million of these, and production would actually continue for a few years. But I mentioned the Winter War, and that's a good jumping-off point to talk about the Tokarev rifle. I think last time we did a video, I brought out my early example, so I brought out my later example here. Why not? I've done full videos talking about the differences. You can check those out. But this rifle is actually very pertinent to our entire story. While Russia wasn't sure of the use of submachine guns in the 1930s, it actually was very forward-thinking when it came to giving the average infantryman, the average soldier, a self-loading or even select-fire rifle. Going back to World War I, you have the 1916 Fedorov, very famous, chambered for 6.5 Japanese. It would actually be produced in somewhat limited, but still produced numbers. When Stalin came in, he was a big proponent of the self-loading rifle system. He was also friends with Tokarev, who was kind of an insider at the time. So they would actually begin testing as early as 1925 on a self-loader, but not much came of it until 1931. Now, Simonov, Sergei Simonov, would be a younger generation, born in 1894. He would go to a technical university, graduating in 1924, so at the age of 30, post-World War I, a lot of things happening. And he would end up being an inspector at the Tula Arsenal beginning in 1926. And it's here he started tinkering with his own self-loading rifle, starting off with the gas trap system. A lot of people used it back then. But in the early 30s, he went to a gas piston system and a kind of a unique bolt with locking wedge system. And this would be his earliest designs that were submitted for trials against more old guard people, including Fedor Tokarev here. Luckily, Simonov had actually worked under and with Fedorov back in the 1920s, so he had experience, and he was just a younger mind. Now, all of these guns are still chambered for 7.62 by 54 rimmed. That's very important. At any rate, Simonov's earliest rifles were produced in limited numbers in 1934 for testing, and at 35. And then, even though Stalin wasn't sure it was the right one to pick, the military was quite on board. It would be adopted as the AVS 36 in 1936. Obviously, just standing for Simonov's rifle, select fire, automatic, 1936. And there would be a relatively limited production run in 1937, 1938. They would only build about 66,000 of the AVS 36 with Simonov's early gas system and bolt system. Had a 15-round attaching mag, again firing 54R. It was an ambitious design and had some things to recommend it. I mean, who else in 1936 except nominally America with its M1 Grand was doing an infantry issue self-loading rifle? But it was not very accurate, especially in full auto. The cartridge is just bulky as hell. And it was very complicated to clean, disassembly. The bolt system wasn't always great. The feed path, the feed ramp wasn't great. It just, even before it really went into combat, wasn't fantastic. That's why in 1938, the immediate forerunner of this gun was adopted. Tokarev, who'd been working on semi-autos even longer, going back to as early as 1910, his design, the SVT-38, was adopted. And it was a semi-automatic only, detaching 10-round mag gun, using a tilting, tipping bolt system, short-stroke gas piston, and he was friends with Stalin. So, even though the committee recommended the SVT-38 at the end of that year, Stalin approved it in 1939. Now, there was ongoing testing, including with Simonov's design, but Stalin ordered that year that testing stopped. Nope, we're going with the 1938 model from Tokarev. That's what's going to be produced. So it was put into production at Tula and later Izhevsk, I believe, was the order. But they would only build about 100, maybe 150,000 of those because, well, it too wasn't great. Already noticing problems, they would come to a head for the SVT-38, for that matter, some for the PPD-38 as well, with the Winter War in Finland, beginning in November 1939, running through March of 1940. The shortcomings of these guns became quite clear, including soldiers accidentally dumping the magazine with the 38, because it was just a flap down here getting hit. Note it has a lock on this, and we actually have the same kind of lock on our PPSH-41. This is important for later on the SKS. There were plenty of other things, not to dive too deep in, but let's just say production was quickly halted of the 38. It just had too many glitches in the system. So in 1940, again, Simonov says, I've worked my design over, I fixed some things, I've simplified some things, but really just because they were already set up to make the Tokarev, and because Tokarev was Stalin's friend, Stalin liked him enough at the time, he was given another chance, and that's where the SVT-40 comes from. We have further refinements, including the mag catch, given essentially a safety. The stock was simplified, and barrel bands were simplified, yada yada yada. Doesn't matter for this video. But the important bit was 1940, the model of 1940 was put into production, again at Tula, Izhevsk, and Podolsk eventually, would be building these, and the idea was 1/3 of the army was to have a self-loading rifle. The other 2/3 could have a submachine gun or a bolt action like a Mosin, but Russia was really pushing ahead with this design. So why is it not the iconic Great Patriotic War rifle of the USSR? Frankly, as much as I like the SVT, and as many good aspects as it has, it too was a failure. It was never accurate enough, especially on rapid fire. It was sometimes considered to be too fragile, too flimsy. Soldiers trained on bolt actions weren't always sure how to work with it. And of course, it still suffered from firing 7.62x54 rimmed. Just a large cartridge, even when you give them a big old honking muzzle brake to work with. And of course, it just sucked up a lot of production ability. Before the Germans came in, when Stalin thought they had time, They hoped to produce up to 2 million of these a year, enough to re-equip the army. But the Germans came early. Russia was surprised. Resources were in short, so production was scaled back, especially as factories had to move east to get out of the way of Germans. In the end, like I said, they wanted to produce 2 million a year. They actually only produced about 1.6 million total. Production was officially ended in January of 1945, but in reality, it was already being severely scaled back by 42, 43. So most of these were built in 1941, 1940, that time period. So yeah, it was an interesting step forward, but it didn't work out. Instead, they would either build PPSH-41s or revert back to the good old Mosin 9130. They even tried making these as snipers, building about 50,000. They didn't work. They even tried a select fire version, which this one originally was, until it was converted back in the war. Obviously, being select fire when the gun's already known for being too lightweight and too recoily, it was a stopgap measure in 1942, but it already ended by 1943. That would be the AVT-40. Just kind of sharing with you the context. Now, Simonov, for his own part, he was not bad, frankly. Before the war kicked off, there were plans for trials. There was even a carbine version of this planned, the SKT-40, and Simonov had his own carbine prototype known as the SKS-41. But not much happened with these because, well, the war happened. And he would go on to great success with his PTR-S-41, an anti-tank rifle in 14.5mm, semi-automatic 5-round magazine, which he'd been working on since 1938. And this actually got him great praise from Stalin and, in fact, the Stalin Prize. So that's what Simonov was working on at the beginning of the war, and it actually was a very good gun against the relatively lightly armored German tanks that were at the beginning of the war. But I digress, although I really like tanks. It's something I talk about on my personal channel a lot. So that's kind of setting the stage. Not much happens, obviously, in 1942, because Russia is fighting off, the back foot. Future plans had to be put on hold. But in 1943, as the war starts to become more balanced, and especially after the Battle of Kursk, Russia is able to kind of breathe a little bit and think towards the future. And here it is, the humble 7.62x39 cartridge with its full name of 7.62x39mm M43 for a cheer. This is an intermediate cartridge. Russian studies, especially looking at combat with the German invasion, showed that while, Mosins and SVTs could fire hundreds, even up to 1,000 meters, most combat was close in. Under 300, maybe under 100, sometimes very close in for CQB, urban warfare. That's why the PPSH-41 with its 7.60x25 Tokarev round was doing so well. So, you had a bunch of recoil and range that you didn't really need. Now, people think about the 8mm Kurz round, 7.92x33 out of Germany with the MP44, which is very true, but it itself was inspired by America's 7.62x33 M1 carbine round. To be fair, that's a straight-walled cartridge, a round-nosed bullet. It's not quite as much oomph to really make it an intermediate round. It's still more pistol caliber than not. But Germany took it, gave it a Spitzer-type bullet, gave it a bottleneck cartridge, but they kept it pretty stubby. It's a fat, stubby bullet, 8x33. Russia took that, and this is more of a committee design. This wasn't something that Simonov or Tokarev or even Kalashnikov made. This is something that Russia came up with. And they used their standard 30 caliber 7.62 bullet. And they went to a 39 casing So longer than the American or the German round, but still significantly shorter than the standard rifle. And they went to a rebated, a recessed, or a rimless cartridge. Having that rim on 54R was a bit of a detractor for a lot of reasons. So they developed this cartridge in 1943, although originally it was actually 7.62 by 41. They would slightly tweak the design in a few years to make it the 39 we know and love today. Just, balancing it out a little bit. They said, okay, we've come up with this new round. Designers, make us something. Actually, rather, several somethings for it. They wanted a bolt-action rifle, traditional. They wanted a self-loading carbine. They wanted a submachine gun. And they wanted a light machine gun. All firing 7.62 by 39, really embracing the intermediate concept. They weren't doing a one-size-fits-all firearm. They were doing a one-size-fits-all cartridge. And this is actually where we end up with the AK-SKS situation. In Russia, 1943 was an important year for small arms, not just because of the beginning of 7.62 by 39, but also several guns received facelifts or improved versions or alternative versions. Like I said, the SVT was taken out of production for the most part and replaced with the 9130. That was definitely a stopgap. In 1943, 50,000 M44 rifles, or at least early prototypes of, were built at the Izhevsk arsenal for testing, and they were popular. So, in 1944, they were officially adopted and become standard issue within the Red Army. In fact, it was that army's very first carbine. Before that, they were all rifles, as standard issue. That was the bolt action. Of course, it's still firing 7.62 by 54R, and it's just a Mosin Nagant. Although it's the last major version, it was basically an M38 with a slightly extended barrel, a folding spike bayonet assembly, and just shorter overall length of about 40 inches, 20.5-inch barrel, weighing in at roughly 9 pounds. Keep that in mind as far as stats. So this would be the standard, and already by 1944 they produced well over 3.5 million, and nearly that many in 1945, and it would remain in production after the war. But that was just a stopgap in the rifle role until, frankly, something better came along. But it does show that the SVT-40 was at the end of its life. Yeah, not much going on there. What about submachine guns? The Papasha, the burp gun as it would become known in Korea, was doing really well. Easy to produce, easy to use in the field. However, in closer environments, especially if you're getting in and out of vehicles, it was a little long, and it was a little heavy. You're looking upwards of 12 pounds with the drum. So, after the Russian invasion, work began by Alexei Sudyev on this gun. In 1942, he worked on the PPS-42, and it was released in limited numbers, and then a refined version, the PPS-43, was released halfway through 1943. This is tied directly with the siege of Leningrad, which would not end until early 1944. You might be wondering why they had two submachine guns, both chambered for 7.62 25 Tokarev. Well, this wasn't meant to replace the PPSH. For one, they were already well set up to make these, and this is a good gun out in the field. This is meant more for urban combat. It's also meant to be cheaper and easier to mass produce. We have a top folding stock. We have a slightly shorter barrel, about 10 inches. We have a somewhat more effective muzzle brake. Now these were open bolts, and they were not select fire. They were just full auto, and they only fed from stick magazines. So just, yeah. Of course, both of these are semi-auto. This is a US build. This is a Polish build, yada yada. So they were produced concurrently in 1944, and they would make about 2 million of these, with production actually ending right after the war in 1946. But it was far from a failure. In fact, many, including Kalashnikov himself, consider this the best submachine gun of World War II. Simple, easy to use, easy to maintain, easy to build. This is almost all stampings. And we have a folding stock, really for the first time. What's interesting too is the dimensions, especially of their 42, are very similar to Kalashnikov's later gun. It was about 35 inches long with the stock deployed. This one brings that down to about 33. And it's lighter than the Papa Shah at about 7 pounds. But it really employed stamped construction, was cheaper, and it was a really good submachine gun. It really pushed technology forward. So these are the subguns. But the M44 and the SVT-40 were held back by their 7.62x54R round. It was a little too boisterous and punchy for what it was needed. Likewise, while 7.62x25 was an excellent pistol round for use in a submachine gun, and these were excellent submachine guns, it, by its very nature, had limitations. Range, penetration, so on and so forth. And that's why our 7.62x39 is so important. They hoped it would kind of solve that gap. It's literally in between the two cartridge sizes. So did it work? What happened? How did those 4 guns they planned for it boil down? Well, let's first talk subguns. Now we can talk about Mikhail Kalashnikov and start to explain why Russia adopted both the AK and the SKS. Yeah, 1943, the 7.62x41 cartridge, as it was known at the time, was developed. In November, it was kind of ready to go. Specs for the cartridge were sent to factories, and they started making cartridges. And by the spring of that next year, people were starting to submit designs for the 4 categories. Now, the first to actually be fulfilled and go into full production would be the light machine gun, is the RPD-44 by Ditiev. Old school gun maker. Yeah, this was, at least on paper, the first to get adopted for the new cartridge. Now, Kalashnikov would end up submitting for the submachine gun. Now, we would call it an assault rifle, but that name didn't really exist then. The closest analog was the submachine gun, and it was a development out of these. While Mikhail Kalashnikov had little to do with the PPSH-41 himself, he did have some connection to the PPS-43. In fact, he worked briefly under Sudiev on his AS-44 prototype, which was really the earliest gun to be produced in limited numbers for 7.62, 41, 39 in this category. And so Mikhail Kalashnikov was on that side. He'd also been working on various other submachine gun style weapons since 1942, so that's kind of where he was working from. And unfortunately, Sudiev would pass away, and so that design would not go much of anywhere. But Mikhail Kalashnikov would kind of go from there, making the AK-1 prototype with a machined receiver, and the AK-2 prototype with a stamped, again, kind of stamping based on the 43 here. And these would evolve into the AK-46. Obviously, we're in the post-war time period now, still working on the submachine gun aspect, assault rifle if you prefer. And the AK-46 started off amongst many others, but was kind of shortlisted at the end of 1946, being whittled down to one of 3 designs, and it failed. Then again, they all failed. Of course, that would not be the end, but it does start to show the difficult future of this new system for 7.6239, 7.6241, and now we start to really understand why the SKS was adopted. You know you're watching a Mishaco deep dive when it takes half an hour to even get to the featured gun. So, we finally get to it. But I really wanted to give you context, and I hope this helps, because, as I said earlier, when I was young, people really didn't understand why this exists. And it's often said it was a fail-safe. The funny thing is, it wasn't even the most conservative design. No, that would have been the bolt action in 7.62x41/39, which never came to fruition. It was just felt that was their really hedging bet, worst case, because of their experiences with the SVT. Let's just end here with this SVT. Like I said, production was officially ended in 1945. They built 1.6 million, and really after World War II, these were never in active frontline Soviet Army use. They were refurbished, put into storage, kept there for a decade, and officially declared obsolete in 1955. And they were not exported to many nations. So that was it. Kind of a dead-end design. The M44 actually had more going on. They would keep these in production in Russia up to about 1948. And they would build just over 7.7 million, although the vast majority, over 6 million of those, were built before the end of 1945. So, yeah, they built some in the last couple of years, but basically just using up parts. And, of course, these would stay in frontline service in some areas in Russia well into the 50s, and then be given over to other nations. And that's where the M44 really spreads around the world and becomes quite important. And then we get to the SKS, the self-loading carbine in the series. Simonov had obviously been perfecting his design ever since before the AVS-36 was adopted. He had the PTR-S41 that was quite successful, and he had the SKS-41 prototype ready to go before World War II kicked off for Russia, but that had to be shelved. But once the 7.62x39-41 M43 cartridge was released, he quickly obtained some samples and realized that he could scale down his design, and it actually worked really well with the new round. It fed better and was a good gun, good carbine. And so in 1944, it went into trials against a few other examples, including one from Tokarev. And the next year, in 1945, it was officially adopted as the SKS-45, basically Simonov's carbine, model 1945. It's said that some pre-production models were used in 1944 on the Belarusian front, and that some were also spotted in 1945 as Russia was taking Berlin. It's entirely possible. Why would they not? But these were just pre-production models. You can tell that it was kind of meant to fill the same role as the M44 because they're essentially the same overall length, 40 inches. They both have 20.5-inch barrels. They even both have folding bayonets. And of course, the M44 has a spiker. Interestingly, the SKS originally did too. The pre-production models did, and actually even the first year of production had a spiker bayonet. So that was actually carried over. Also, it started off without a chrome-lined bore, just like the M44. And weight-wise, they're basically about the same, around 9 pounds. So you can tell that, yeah, this was meant to plug that role, and it was the middle thing. The role that the Kalashnikov's gun would fulfill was the most radical, and the bolt action was a little more than a rechambered Mosin. But luckily, Simonov had been perfecting this design for years, and it really does show. And so that allowed them to retire the M44. Now, why did they retire it in 1948 from production? That's because they actually did not put this into production, the SKS, until 1949. Yeah, after World War II, the design was essentially shelved. That might seem strange after it had just been adopted, but keep in mind Russia had plenty of guns, other priorities, other things going on, and it was ready to go, but they would revisit it later. This also gave Simonov a little more time to work on the fine details, several years, and that's why when it popped into production at Tula in 1949, it was almost perfected. We'll talk about changes, but they are very minor, and it did work very well. And that was good, because Kalashnikov's gun was having some issues. We'll get to that, but I do want to kind of talk about the Tokarev rifle one more time before putting it up. And you can tell these two designs grew up together and borrowed from each other. They both have short stroke gas pistons, and while the early Simonov guns had a complicated wedge bolt system, he would go to the tilting tipping bolt that Tokarev used, and several others used as well. That kind of leads one to the other. You have a somewhat similar top cover system, just easier to take off. Similar control layout, safeties, that kind of thing. They really are that. If you can look at an AVS 36 or a PTR S41, you'll see that. The magazine, though, is interesting. And this is a point of criticism for some on the SKS. We have a fixed 10-round, although it is double-stacked magazine, intended to be fed from the top with 10-round chargers, clips. I'm not going to obviously put it in all the way because we're at a table here, but you get the idea. Press it in, let the bolt go forward. Why is that? Well, actually, the answer is right here. Remember, I talked about the mag release. Yeah, they added the lock with the 40, but that same year, Stalin himself rather insisted to Simonov and others that he wanted a fixed magazine, so it could not be lost. This would also cheapen production, because you only have one mag instead of at least 3 per gun, and you just have to make more cheap disposable stripper clips. So this was actually a Stalin order dating all the way back to 1940. And all the way back then, Simonov would actually present him with 2 ideas, a 5-round fixed mag and a 10. But in 1941, Stalin felt and others felt that they weren't quite evolved yet, so they needed more work. Well, this is the ultimate evolution of what Simonov was ordered to do. 10-round mag, and of course you can pop it like that to dump ammo very quickly, very much like on a Mosin, and let it go forward. Obviously, these are both reciprocating cocking handles on the bolt. Again, the bolt systems are actually very, very similar. And this is, of course, an early production SKS. Not a 1949, but close. So it's a good example. It's the best I could find for this. So you really can see where the Tokarev rifle and Simonov early designs influenced this and how it all led up to here. Speaking of here, well, what's Kalashnikov up to? And let's compare these two designs. Now my AK is of course a build on an early AK Type 3 kit with some AK Type 2 things going on. And this, like I said, 1950. This would have been built 1953. So they're actually quite close together. And this is when they were being produced concurrently at Izhevsk. Briefly, they would. So Kalashnikov, you might think Kalashnikov and Simonov had a rivalry, but no. You know, like Simonov was the young kid compared to Fedorov and Tokarev, but Mikhail Kalashnikov, born much later in 1919, was the next generation, and he actually met and worked with Simonov at the Insk Proving Grounds in 1944, and in his memoirs, he actually said that Simonov was very good to him, taught him a lot, and treated him like, quote, a little brother. So they seemed to get on with each other quite well. And Kalashnikov was having troubles. It actually would kind of justify Russia creating this as a fallback or carbine with this as the subgun, because like I said, the original AK-46 failed in 1946, but there was a reprieve. This is when they reworked 7.6241 into 7.6239, so they gave all the designers a chance to go back to their design and rechamber it for the new cartridge. That's all they were meant to do. The SKS was fine. The change really didn't affect it, except, altering the chamber and whatnot a little bit. And again, it wasn't in full production, so Simonov could do that. So that was Pat. He was fine. Kalashnikov and his team actually took this opportunity to really rework the design, going from a short-stroke gas piston with a gas system, kind of a low-profile gas system like this, to this style, which was actually borrowed from another prototype, the AB-46. This is a long stroke fixed to the carrier system. He reworked the top cover, gave it a captive recoil spring, yada yada yada. Actually reworked the trigger system. But it's a given. This is the AK-47 prototype. It's a very different gun. And the number 2 prototype would be a fixed stock. Number 4 would be an underfolder. Underfolders from the whole time. And this would actually be finalized in November of 1947, going to trials. And while the AK-47 prototype was the least accurate of the guns being tested, it was the simplest, most dependable, most durable. So it was selected on that basis. And one has to wonder if maybe they selected this gun and didn't care so much about its accuracy because they had this gun. We have a 20-inch barrel, semi-automatic only, fixed magazine. So let's have a 16-inch detaching mag select fire gun. And of course the original Type 1s were stamped receiver. Not stamped like we know it today, but stamped more like the PPS 43 technology. And those were put into production at Izhevsk in 1949. So technically both guns were put into production, this at Tula, in 1949, except this was a much more mature design, whereas the Kalashnikov, it still had learning to do. This is actually why in 1950 Izhevsk petitioned to switch from the machined receiver, the machined trunnion and the stamped receiver, to the machined receiver design, because they were having trouble with high rejection rates of the stampings. The SKS did not suffer from this because it's on a machined receiver, also machined top cover for that matter. So Tula making the SKS, and Izhevsk making the AK. And the AK's having problems. Not in the field, they're not blowing up, they're not having like stress fractures on the receivers. It's rejection rate at the factory. Get it? So in 1951, the AK Type 2 with the first machined receiver appears, and this would give way to the AK Type 3 in 1953 with a somewhat simplified, streamlined milled receiver and some other minor changes that don't matter. So this is the first time the AK is kind of good to go. And this is when we start to see larger production. Meanwhile, our SKS here, it's being built for a few years at Tula. And in 1953 and 1954, Izhevsk would join in, building some as well. So we have this as the jump between submachine gun and assault rifle. And we have this is effectively their version of an M1 Grand, or whatever you want to call it. A self-loading, self-sufficient rifle that lets them retire the Mosin. So with that, let's talk about Russian production changes and Russian military service of Simonov's rifle. Here are my 2 Russian SKS carbines. What I like to do is get an early example and a late example of guns. I did it with my Tokarevs, and I try to do it with other things. This is a relatively early one, 1950, and this is a late one, a so-called letter series or letter code. Originally, Tula guns would have the date on top and the Tula star. This would last from the beginning in 1949 through 1955. Then, though, they would remove the date and the star from the top cover. They'd put a star on the side of the receiver, and they would give a date code. D, or at least the Russian English equivalent translation, for 1956, I, 1957, K, 1958. These were all done at Tula. Izhevsk had long stopped making these, and yes, that does spell out Dick. Even though Simonov's carbine was pretty well perfected in 1949, it would undergo some production changes and a couple of improvements, and one strange deprovement. The first major change had to do with the bayonet, and I wish I had one, but I don't. Oh well. 1949 and into 1950, at least early on, it had an underfolding spike bayonet. But this is very quickly changed in 1950 to the blade. And this is actually a correct blade for this one. You know, if you look at the M44, it had a blued blade, and you look at the the original SKS, the spike was blued, so they kept bluing the bayonet for a time. In 1951, they would go to the polished bayonet. I have a theory about why, but no facts. I'll get to that in a minute. So we have basically a transitional bayonet on this gun. Unfortunately, yeah, the spikes are very uncommon in America, although they do exist, I know. We have other changes. For example, the bayonet housing gets a little lightning cut, which it did not originally have. Machining of the front sight base is ever so slightly different as well. The gas block's an interesting point to look at. This is the earlier kind of swoop style. This is the late concave style. There's also an in-between style, for whatever that's worth. Furniture was Arctic birch, either hardwood, solid wood, or laminate, and it would get a red shellac finish, very Russian style. The metal would have a blued finish with the bolt carrier left in the white, although of course when we run across a lot of the Russian refurbs today, they could have a different shellac finish, and they usually have that real dull black finish combined with a dull kind of gray finish to this part, or even that plum bolt. I've seen both, either that kind of plum look. In fact, you can find some bayonets with a dull plum look, whereas this is a black, shiny type blue. Moving back here, the trigger guard. The way it's machined is a little different. This one has just a straight kind of in to the mag release. And this one has a step here. And the mag release itself is a little different. The ribbing on it is a little finer. This is a little coarser. I also kind of feel like the magazines themselves are ever so slightly machined differently, but that could just be a delusional brain at work. One thing that isn't, and one thing you don't often hear talked about, is the safety. Most SKSs we're familiar with have this kind of detent, springy safety. They shift into position, getting kind of tense in the middle, and then switching over. The early ones, it's just kind of a friction fit lever. Doesn't really snap into position, it just rolls up, rolls down. It's an understandable change. And you'll see some differences, mostly to do with lightning cuts, those kinds of grooves and things elsewhere. And of course, again, refurbishments will change things up here and there. Now, there are two important changes that are internal. One I can show you, one I cannot. So we're going to disassemble these. Obviously, there's a cleaning rod under the barrel, and of course they have a cleaning kit in the buttstock, which is different from a Kalashnikov, but similar principles. And that's another area I can point to changes are the takedown systems. This is for the main receiver here. Notice it's a smaller lip with a hole in it, a little bit larger. And for the gas tube, we have a lip down here. And the later one, we don't have a lip, but we have a hole. That hole is obviously for a bullet tip, presumably 7.62, 39, or anything similar. Good idea. This one's a little sticky or tight on this gun. Come on. So let's get these apart, and I'll talk about those couple of changes. So once you move it, get it to about vertical. This is a captive pin, thankfully. Then your machined top cover comes off. We have a captive recoil spring and guide. And then, of course, our bolt group. Same up here. There are a couple of small differences in the top cover, I should note. It's smooth here. Later ones would get holes, presumably lightning cuts. So the top covers would ever so slightly change. Not sure if the recoil springs really did. Not of note. I think it's just our trigger group and our bolt group here. It's easier to pop the mag out. Bonk. Pulls out very easy. By the way, the SKS does have an out-of-battery safety, which is a good thing. And there's our bolt groups. Our gas system, you just rotate that up and your gas tube comes off. It actually has a long piston and a short kind of spacer, and it has a short spring and a long spring. I don't feel like taking them out now. You can look at SKS disassembly videos, but let's look at the bolt group. The carriers themselves are essentially the same. This one has more of a matte finish to it, but it could be a refurbed part. Probably is. This one, very shiny. But the bolts, now we get some interesting changes. For one, this has a cutout on the side here that the later one does not. Presumably a lightning cut. Kind of interesting. But that's not the difference most people talk about. And often mentioned on SKSs is this floating firing pin. It's a problem. These are meant for hard primer rounds, military rounds, and then it's not really an issue. But in civilian hands, especially if a bolt's packed with grease, Cosmoline, if that pin sticks in the forward position, this can lead, and has led to, even in my hands, slam fires. So if you load an SKS, make sure your bolt's clean, and whenever I go to shoot one of these, always, always, always safe direction. Although in America, something people often do is they'll install a spring kit, meaning that the firing pins push back. Good idea, right? I wonder why the Russians never did that. The funny thing is, they did. Notice this is a different tail to the firing pin here. And notice this doesn't stick out or rattle. 1949, 1950, these had spring-loaded firing pins. See, it's got a flat top. This is rounded. But by 1951, they started to use the floating type. Why? I don't know. Maybe it was to save on production time, cost. I mean, you will save 2 or 3 parts this way. Maybe they were having trouble with the spring igniting the hard primers. Maybe they were having light primer strikes. Because if you have too strong of a spring, it can give you light strikes. I've had that happen on a few guns of mine. Not SKSs, but other things. The military primers in the 50s were very hard. So, it was probably either of those or both. Either reliability or ease of production. But I just wanted to point it out for Simonov's sake that he did think about that, and he did integrate that to the design. So that was changed in 1951. That's an odd change. The next one, though, actually makes a lot of sense. I pointed out the blued to the silver bayonet. In 1950, they experimented with chrome plating the bores. Originally, like the Mosins before it, these .30 caliber bores were not chromed. But in 1951, Tula introduced a chrome-lined barrel. This has many benefits: ease of cleaning, longevity, but it does require different technology to do, and as we mentioned earlier in the video, it was really pioneered in Russia with the PPSH-41, so proven quite successful. Maybe they left it off the carbine because this is not select fire, wasn't expected to see near the high round count. It's also often stated that chrome plating can decrease accuracy. Not necessarily because of the chrome itself, although if your chrome is uneven, has bubbles or irregularities, it can, but because you have to intentionally oversize your bore to allow for space for the chrome plating. So unless you get the numbers down right, the specs right, your bore can be either still too tight or too loose. You can see the problem. But by the 50s, they knew what they were doing. So you have a chrome-lined bore with 1951 Russian going forward. And so most all of Tula and all of Izhevsk are chromed. I have to wonder, since the chrome appeared around the same time, if that wasn't what inspired to go from the bayonet to this bayonet. I don't know. It's just something I thought about. Maybe when they started chroming the bore, they had chrome there, they started chroming the bayonets. I don't know. Sometimes these bayonets can also appear kind of goldish colored. Essentially, that's just old oil and grease, cosmoline. It's kind of stained the metal. Originally, they were pretty silver white. So those are the major production changes. Like I said, wood could be hardwood, especially early on. Later, laminate would appear. And after that, well, Russian production would end in 1958 at Tula. You know, the AK challenged it, but the milled AK was still kind of heavy and a little bit spendy to produce. So there was still room for the SKS within the Red Army. They would be in frontline service in the 50s, especially as they still didn't have enough AKs. You know, it was still faster to produce. But what was the death knell was in 1959, the introduction of the AKM with the true stamped receiver that worked well. With that, they had enough milled AKs, and they had a new, quicker to produce version. The SKS, it just didn't have a spot anymore. So that's why production would end. Now, its service would still continue in the Red Army into the 60s, but by then it was retired to second line ceremonial parade guard use. I will say that probably the point where it saw the most actual field use was in 1956 with the Hungarian uprising. But of course the AK was also there. But after this time it was being pulled out. Although I will again say, secondary services, well, not secondary services, but services that used a rifle as a secondary tool, like the Navy and the Air Force, the Air Guard, the VVS and the PDF, I mean the PDV, sorry, would keep SKSs around for like guard and whatnot because they were fine. So some of these would kick about air bases up until the 1980s. The longer range that this would afford you, even if it was slight, and the longer sight radius could actually be of use. But whereas the original AK and the SKS were roughly the same weight, with the new AK, the AK is lighter, it's select fire, detaching mags. Stalin's gone now, so that kind of idea about fixed mags being the way to go is over. I also want to credit that this wasn't Simonov's idea. He was ordered to make a fixed mag, so he did what he was ordered. That's all. So, yeah. That's Russia for you. Alright, back here. So kind of focusing on the Russians. Some people have giant SKS collections, and that's cool. And I've always just kind of wanted to have a couple of each. And when it comes to the Russians, I have my early and my late. I'm very happy with them. The late one, Or was it the early? I can't remember. One of them I traded off my Ishesk for, and I'm happy with it. The Ishesk was a rebuild. It still had the blued finish, but I wanted appropriate early and appropriate late. And again, I can't remember which one it was. I want to say it was the late letter, but I could be wrong. I'm very, very pleased with my early one. I mean, a spiker would be even cooler, but I'm just happy it's a pretty unmonkeyed with example. And the letter code's really neat because it does inform a lot of what was going on 56, 57 in that era. Now, the Russian SKS in America really came after the Chinese. It started to pop over here through importers. I remember mostly KBI, which was Kastner's before the ban. And they brought over some cool guns. You could get them in a hammer and sickle marked box. Presentation was pretty cool. Old military greasy box. They came with a belt pouch with stripper clips in it, sling, cleaning kit, sometimes a few other little bobs and things. And as famously known, they were very inexpensive. And because of that, more than a few people bubbled them. It wasn't too bad in the early 90s when they could still get AK types, but when the Chinese AKs dried up, people really went at the SKS because it was technically quote-unquote pre-ban. Now we're talking about the 94 assault weapons ban, not the 89 import ban, so people would pull them out of their beautiful laminate or hardwood stocks and put them in Tapco. And it broke your heart. You would see a great gun, at least it was, but it was put into a Tapco stock, and the top cover had been replaced with a, wasn't even always Picatinny. Sometimes it was actually Rings or a Weaver top cover, which wouldn't hold zero for shit. And of course, if they had saved the original parts, this could be reversed, and they never did. They were always lost. And also, too, people would get those wonky 20 or 30 round magazines and take off the magazine bodies. So when you are looking at an SKS, check especially the serials on the top cover and the magazine body, as well as on the stock, if it's a gun that had them marked on the stock. But that explains why a lot of them aren't matching now. They probably were at one time, but Bubba got a hold of them because he could pick them up for $100, even less sometimes. And it does break your heart because you could go through pallets of these. They came in crates, and pretty much all years, even Ishesks and Tulas everywhere, and most of them that were sold were in just great shape. Even the Arsenal refurbs, they're fine. They have their own purpose. They were done. But yeah, these are the two Russians I've selected. And by the way, the gentleman who's my friend that I traded my old Ishesk off to, I still know him. I'll get it back one day. That's kind of how we roll. But it was a deal that let me finish up my collection. And to be honest, the only difference is the markings, which to you matters. To me, I can't see them, so meh. But my Russians, I never really got them as a shooter. They were always cool and collectible because I started to view this as Russia's kind of M1 Garand or M1 Carbine, which early on people didn't do. They viewed it as a less cool AK. But that's the wrong way to look at the SKS. If you look at it as World War II era or early Cold War era self-loading gun, like say the FN-49 or the AG-42, it takes on a whole other light. Compared to those contemporaries, it's a really good gun. Relatively light and easy to load and very reliable compared to a lot of the others. And of course it fires a very accessible cartridge, or at least it was up until stuff went down with Russia. So I'm really rooting for PSA to crank up their steel production ammo. Yeah, we talked about that during the Patreon Q&A. But I always, grab my Russians for more of the historical purpose, trying to find the best ones I could, and I'm very content. I've had a few over the years. I remember when I bought my very first one, I actually paid the princely sum of about $150 because I was slightly late to the party, so I paid a little more. I haven't had it in ages. I've upgraded over time, but I did. I thought it was cool. And just briefly comparing SKS to AK, what do they have in common? Well, they fire the same cartridge, and they are based on machined receivers, at least this era of production. About the same weight, like I said, in the 8+ pounds, 8.5 give or take pounds, although that does give the SKS a bayonet, whereas the AK doesn't. Fun fact, the AK originally wasn't designed with a bayonet in mind because, again, submachine gun. That's why the Type 1 bayonet seemed kind of tacked on, because it was. And, of course, it used heavy slab-side mags. But ways they're different, almost every. Long stroke versus short stroke gas piston, 16 versus 20-inch barrel, traditional stock versus pistol grip and stock or underfolder, rotating 2-lug versus tilting tipping, more traditional safety, fire mode selector combined in the AK. Sights are pretty similar, I'll give them that. Although, again, submachine gun, this was up to 800 meters. Later the AKM would go to 1,000 when the whole assault rifle concept really came around. This, because it was meant to be a traditional rifle, does have a 1,000-meter rear sight. Similar, adjustable but enclosed versus open. Cleaning right under the barrel, of course, again, 10-round stripper clips. They usually carry these in a pouch. Yeah, and the sling's essentially the same. Cleaning kit's different, though. Fun fact. So in the 50s, while the AK was the future, the SKS was more conservative, even a relic of World War II, if you kind of account the early pre-production trials. By 1959 with the AKM, yeah, it's over in Russia. And production's over at Tula and Izhevsk. But they would only really be beginning their lives. In Russia, they would build about 2.7 million of these. So, 1 million more plus than the SVT-40. So, not a failure. And Simonov himself would be awarded his second Stalin Prize because of the SKS. It was a good gun for what it was, and like I said, it provided a good guard gun, police gun, militia gun for a while. Not too crazy as far as capacity and rate of fire. But where it really would make its name for itself would be around the world, both in Russian-produced guns given to communist allies and licensed-produced guns around the world as well. In total, it's estimated that between 10 and 15 million SKSs have been made. So, actually, the majority outside of Russia. The lowest number I've ever found is 5 million, but that does seem awfully low considering how many some of these countries made. So with that, yeah, let's look at other users of the SKS. And this is really where it earned its name during the Cold War. And we'll start off relatively close to home with starting around 1954-55, Soviet Russia was keeping the SKS in production, but it was clear that it was not really going to go to their own army, not for long anyway. No, they were thinking more about exporting it to communist guerrilla groups, rebel groups, or friendly allied nations. And, you know, the military aid is rarely, if ever, no strings attached. They would either just outright sell them or, you know, we'll give you these and you do us a favor. So it was in their interest, and this was the last generation's technology. They had the AK, and so, yeah, they started sending these over to several nations. I wonder if that's why the date disappears when we go to the codes according to the system. And there are people that argue that it's not correct, but according to the commonly held system, this gun, for example, was made in 1957. But at any rate, they were exported in Europe to several friendly nations like Hungary, which is a little odd because that means both sides actually had them in 1956. Bulgaria had some. Czechoslovakia would get some, which is also a bit odd. We'll talk about that later on. And whatnot. In the middle here, though, I have my Romanian M56. While many nations use the SKS in some capacity, well over 50, some sources say over 70, not many actually built their own, meaning that the Cugir arsenal, there you go, whichever way you prefer, is one of a few and only a couple within Europe itself, which makes sense because Russia had millions of these to give away. But no, they would select it in 1956, and it would enter into production in 1957. This is actually a late production example, dated 1960, which, as far as I know, was the last year of production. How many did Cugir produce? No one knows. Some sources put it as low as about 75,000. Some put it into the multiple hundreds of thousands, but most agree, 80 to 100,000 is probably about right. And it is very similar to the late style here. Very, very similar, with only a few changes. I should point out that the markings on the Cugir gun sometimes confuses people. Izhevsk in Russia use a triangle with an arrow in it. Well, Cugir's symbol is not dissimilar. It's actually a triangle with a different type of arrow. They are different, but look at pictures for yourself, and you'll familiarize. Of course, Tula is easy, star. When it comes to SKS specifically, yeah, Izhevsk was not making them in 1960. Likewise, Cugir was not making them in 1954, so that's easy. But when it gets to AK stuff, it does get a little more confusing. Flipping these over, yeah, the Cugir production is just similar as the late Russian. Lightning cuts and all, bayonet styling. Blued finish. The bluing's a little different, but still blued. Both have, of course, wood stocks. As far as I know, the Romanians mostly use beechwood, so slightly different type than Russian. And I could be wrong, guys, but I don't think they use laminate. I think the Romanian is hardwood. That said, a number of Romanian guns have shown up in America with a mix of parts, including Russian. So, probably chances are that Russia sent over several thousands before they ramped up their own production. And it's also possible that Russia sent them leftover parts to help with Cugir's production. So, if you find a Romanian gun that has some Russian parts, they could very well be correct. Blued finish and that. Of course, they don't have the same type of red shellac. You'll notice this one has a leather sling on it. As far as I know, that's correct for this gun. But you can find all kinds of slings on SKSs, from Mosins to AKs and everything in between. But, I would say the different wood is about the only distinguishing feature aside from the markings themselves. And SKSs do have a lot of markings, some stamped, some electropinned. Of course, you have bolt carrier, top cover, receiver, trigger guard, magazine body. That's a critical one because a lot of times they get replaced. You also have gas tube and even gas piston, although that's almost always electro-pinned. And even, I believe, some have marked rear sights. Obviously, I'm not too big an expert on serials because I can't see them, so, we know what we know. But the Romanian guns, the M56 as it was known, They served for a long time in Romania. Attrition's pretty high. They've been imported here, but they're not too common when you consider that Russia built over 2.5 million, Romania building 100,000-ish, maybe even less. Yeah, it's a lot fewer. And they stayed in secondary use within Romania, Garda-type units. And Romania would actually send some as war aid to friendly nations over the years. And yeah, they just, they kind of wore out. They are chrome-lined, by the way. Otherwise, about the same. Of course, Romania did also adopt the AK as the PM, the original milled AK, that is. But these were Russian guns that were brought over, or at least at the very most assembled there. It wasn't until the AKM with the PM63 they actually had AK production at Cugir. So this came first. And, you know, one nice thing about the SKS versus the AKM, it could be built on existing tooling. This was old school technology. Yeah, it costs more to machine a receiver than stamp if you're set up to stamp, but you do have to set up to stamp. Kind of going all the way back to us talking about the PPSH-41. It took time to set up production because it was so different. So that was attractive to certain nations, and it meant that the Cugir arsenal, which had been there, could just pretty well go up and running in a year making these with of course, Russian help and Russian parts and all that stuff. But no, I really do find the Cugir guns interesting. Unfortunately, a lot of them are pretty worn, so you kind of have to moderate your expectations if you do pick one up. Well, the Romanian M56 is often overlooked, and it is kind of odd that Romania did it. You would think other nations would, and there aren't that many in America, and a lot of them are mismatched, which turns some people off, even if that's correct how they came in the country, and others are kind of ragged out. Mine here is a pretty nice gun compared to many other Romanians. I think it's the third one I've had, maybe the fourth one. A couple I have had to come in had sanded stocks, and that drives me nuts. One of them had a really wonky stock. I don't know. And originally I wanted to pick one up back when the Russians were getting expensive, so I could use the Romanian as a shooter, because at that time they were less money. But it was one that did elude me for a few years. It took me a little time to find a good Romanian, because I did miss the import batch. I remember them coming in, but I didn't get in a hurry, and before I knew it, they were gone. So, you know, mistake I made in my younger days. It really, things like that taught me, when it comes to imports, if you want it, pick it up then. If not, don't worry about it. But luckily, I did end up getting my Romanian, and it is a cool gun. It goes well with my Wassers and SAR-1. I even had a Romanian M44 for a while, but eventually let it go because you can't have everything. Just how life is. But they are nice. The bluing is very deep, very nice on them. And the furniture has a different texture. But the thing about SKSs, and the reason I don't have a wall collection of them, is they are very samey for the most part. They really only vary in their markings and other small details. Most of your nations really produced it not only to the same pattern, but the same late Russian or Soviet style pattern. But if you are collecting old CNR guns and you haven't really looked into the Romanian M56, check it out. Unfortunately, the gun I bought to be kind of my shooter, well, now these are basically almost as collectible as the Russians. It's really coming down out there. I love the sound of rain and thunder. Anywho, let's move on. Go back to the table. And here it is open, ready to accept a stripper clip just for fun. I don't know. But yeah, it makes sense why Romania would make these. And they actually approached Poland as well. In 1955, the plan was for the Factory 11, what we know today as FB Radom, the Luxembourg factory ZM in the communist era. They were going to build the SKS as the KSS carbine to be the standard infantry rifle, replacing the M44, and the milled AK is the PMK, which basically just means Kalashnikov submachine gun, to replace the PPSH 41, PPS 43, and Poland's own unique PPS 4352. So that was the plan. We're going to produce both concurrently. But testing in Poland in 1956 revealed that there's really no advantage to producing the SKS. You do get a little bit more range and velocity out of this barrel versus an AK, but in practical terms that just didn't matter. They felt the cost just wasn't worth it. It was better just to have one gun. They would later experiment with doing a long-barreled AK variant in Poland, so that's kind of their answer. And at first, the Soviets, they weren't going for it. They were going to basically strong-arm the Polish into purchasing the rights to build the KSS, because it was in Russia's best interest. But the Polish managed to get out of this and just produce the AK. I don't know exactly how, but they did. So the only SKSs in Poland were some earlier Russian examples. I think a lot of 1953, 54 show up there. We don't know exactly how many were sent over. I've seen as many as 2,000. Other numbers say fewer than 1,000. But the ones that ended up in Poland were used for guard guns, ceremonial guns, and they were even sometimes reworked at Factory 11, getting Polish buttstocks. You can tell a Polish buttstock because of the wood used, also the fact that they don't have the cleaning kit compartment in the butt. So that's the thing, but those are very uncommon in America. So that's as close as Poland ever got to an SKS, was building some stocks to use their guns. But there is one more famous SKS. That would be from the DDR. Did you think I was going to pull out a Karabiner-S? No, I don't have one. Very, very, very few are in America, although a friend who lives here in town does have one. It's a Vietnam bringback, and that's about the only ones in America, the ones that kind of worked their way home from Vietnam. I would have asked to borrow it for this video from him, but unfortunately, over in Vietnam, it was restocked out of its original, which is kind of the whole point of the Karabiner-S. So about the only thing left over is a very well-worn gun and some interesting markings. But yeah, the East Germans did build some. No one knows how many or for how long or even why, because it was later than Romania. Like I said, they adopted it as the M56 starting in 57. East Germany adopted it around 1957 or 58, and production at the very most was from 1958 to 1961, although most people say really it was just 1959, 1960. Hard to say. And how many were built? Also hard to say. Communism, yeah. So why were they doing it? I don't know. Maybe they couldn't get out of it like Poland. Maybe they were hedging their bets because they were tooling up to make the Kalashnikov as the MPIK, and the early guns that they were building did have issues. The DDR guns, the East German guns, were built at the Ernst Thälmann factory, which way back before World War II was the Simson factory. Then it would be taken over by the Nazis and then taken over again. Either way, it was the primary production facility. And like I said, they would be known as the Karabiner-S for Simonov. And it was a standard late-style gun as far as the metal goes, but what made it unique was the furniture. Essentially, it took a Mauser-style sling, so it had a slot in the stock for the sling to pass through, and it looped up front. It had no cleaning rod under the barrel, and because of the slot in the stock, there wasn't enough space for the cleaning kit compartment, plus they used a belt-style cleaning kit anyway. So yeah, no cleaning kit compartment here, no spot for a cleaning rod, and kind of that unique light oil finished. I think it's beechwood stock and, of course, blued finish. Hard to say more because we don't have them. I believe one of the key markings is the MF and V on them. Then they're going to have some other proof markings. They also usually have a 2-digit date code as part of their serial, but their serials are kind of intentionally scattered and obscured and weird. Something to point out, East Germany was often used as a third party by the Soviets, a proxy, to sell or give weapons to other nations that might be controversial for Russia to do themselves. So I have to wonder if that's why they might have done that, because that does seem like the destination for most of the Karabiner-S's. There are pictures with German border guards carrying them, and also in German like parades and ceremonies. But in the main military, not many. But we do know, obviously, because my friend even has a gun, they were already sending several over in the 1960s to North Vietnam, to the Viet Cong, to fight American and, of course, before that, French. We also know that in 1991, after the end of the split between West and East Germany, that a lot of them showed up in Croatia and that war zone. So it seems like a lot of them were probably given away in the 60s and 70s to various hotspots, and the ones that survived into the 80s ended up going into the Yugoslavian grinder. And this is further backed up by the fact that a lot of East German AKs, including a lot of the kits we ended up with, went there as well. Either way, production was very brief, as short as 2 years, maybe as long as 4 at the Ernst Thälmann factory. But, of course, the AK would quickly eclipse it. Cool gun, though, and exceedingly hard to find in America. Maybe one day an importer will turn up a cache, but I've hoped that for 20 years, and it hasn't happened yet. And, you know, within the Warsaw Pact in Europe itself, those are the producers. Of course, again, it was exported wide and far, including down to the Middle East, which gets us to an interesting situation and an interesting gun, commonly lumped in with an SKS. Not an SKS, but since we're doing a deep dive video, let's bring it out. Egypt's Rasheed, or Rasheed. You actually saw this in a recent video when I talked about the Egyptian Mahdi, the one in which I overlooked Colonel Nasser, and people pointed that out, rightfully so, but at least now you know I'm human and, you know, have brain farts like anyone else. But this really shows the expansion of Russian power and influence in the Middle East, because the SKS would find its way throughout that region, several nations and non-governmental groups, also down into Africa. Now, of course, the Rasheed is not an SKS, but it's SKS adjacent. And more importantly, Egypt itself was a major user of the SKS in the 1950s. Like I said, in 1952, King Farouk was deposed, essentially, sent off to exile. Nominally, his son replaced him, but in fact, a military coup, which Colonel Nasser was one of 3 primary participants in, took control. This would lead to Nasser being the second president, technically, of Egypt. And closer relations with the Com Bloc and pushing the English out in 1954. They would finally completely leave in 56, which would lead to the Suez Crisis, in which the SKS was kind of Egypt's primary gun. Now, what they were trying to do, and you can really see this, Nasser actually was not super pro-communist. In fact, he actually banned the Communist Party in Egypt for a time, I believe. He was trying to do a third world thing. And by third world, I mean the traditional meaning. You know, like Tito's Yugoslavia did it, India as well. Kind of both sides in the middle, and that's what he did. Although at this point, he seems more closely swayed to the east, or rather, the west is kind of unhappy with Egypt at this time. I digress, though. The point is, Russia started sending a lot of SKSs over, as well as 7.62x39 ammo, and since all they had at the time were mostly World War II bolt actions, in 1956, it was a great option. This is a lot better than an old Enfield or Carcano, relatively new production SKS. Now, also that same year, they were working with Sweden to get the AG-42 production line, which would result in the 8mm Hakim. And that was the standard gun. So for a number of years, the Hakim and the imported SKS were basically the standard issue military guns in Egypt. And as you know, in the 60s, they would start up domestic AKM production at Factory 54, Mahdi, outside of Cairo. But there was a brief blip, the Rasheed. I don't know when production began with these. 1960, 62 maybe, hard to say. 8,000 is a common number stated, so very low. And it's just a scaled down Hakim, thus AG-42, but with a few SKS features. Namely, it's chambered for 7.62x39. It even uses these chargers. See, they take SKS clips. Not going to risk accidentally having it go forward. Kind of interesting, though. Another interesting thing, whereas an SKS has a reciprocating handle, this is actually non-reciprocating. You can move it forward. And if you notice, it has a SKS-inspired charging handle, whereas, of course, the Hakim did not. It had the more Lumen style. It also has the safety. It does have a detaching mag here. Pop it out if I can single-handedly. See, Stalin would have loved this. It's a removable 10-round mag, but they didn't make extras. They didn't issue these with multiples as far as I know. It was mostly just removable for cleaning and safety and whatnot. And it does have the Lumen style system. Like the SKS, it is a tipping bolt. Unlike the SKS, this is a true direct impingement gas system. And it's even adjustable. There's a regulator on top of the handguard there. You need a tool to get in there to adjust it. So you can adjust the gas. Trigger is its own thing. Safety back here, so that's nothing like it. But yeah, these are very short-lived in production and even use. I'm not sure. Maybe it was a failed effort. Maybe this was them hedging their bets in case the AK didn't work out. Maybe they were tooling up to do these, but then the news of the AKM production line was coming, so they halted. It is clear, though, that because they were using imported SKSs, this gun came to be. They basically used the tooling they had from Sweden to make their own SKS-inspired gun, complete with an SKS-style bayonet here. My Rasheed over here. I've had a few come in the store. No one knows how many are in the USA. I've seen numbers between 2,000 and 5,000. I've probably personally seen, roughly half a dozen. Including that one I told you about that had the bayonet lug cut off, which was just sad. This one's a pretty good example for all it is. I have fired it. It does shoot. And it's one that actually came back to me. I picked it up local. Actually, it was from the same friend I mentioned when I was doing the Russian SKS trading. Got it from him and considered keeping it, but needs must. We still lived in the old place and money and everything, so I sold it on Well, the gentleman I sold it to years later asked if I wanted to buy it back, rather trade it back, because he wanted a Zastava NPAP underfolder, the DF. And I happened to have some in stock. That's what he wanted. I traded him back, and we were both happy. And I was actually glad to get this gun back, because I had started to regret moving it, because in the grand scheme of Rasheed's, it's a nicer one. It has a few detractions, but with so few in the country, they all do. But, yeah, it's rare in life that once you sell a gun, you get a chance to get it back, and I'm grateful I did. And the thing about Egyptian guns, it seems like you can't just have one. If you're going to do this, you need the Hakim, then you need the Helwan to go with it, and then you need the Mahdi. And I think that's why I sold it originally. I didn't have those others at the time in my personal collection, and I knew it was an all-or-nothing proposition. It's just how it is. Luckily, when I did trade back for it, you could still pick up Hakims, Helwans, Mahdis, and the Egyptian FN-49s. The price had not gone crazy on Mahdis yet. So that's kind of where my Egyptian little, I don't know what, 4-piece, 5-piece collection came from. And it is an interesting piece in history. I like the original Swedish design. And, I mean, this is the last stop in that family. I wish I could know exactly when these were made, but I've looked for years and just can never find an exact production date. And the number of 8,000 keeps getting repeated, so we'll go with it. And it's worth having in the collection just because of how many SKSs Russia sent them and they used, as well as a few other guns. And just that part in history and how the Middle East was faring. But yeah, if you run across one, check it out. I have no idea what they're going for now. Haven't looked in a long while. Here we are with bayonet deployed. It has the same nearly 12-inch blade. It's like 11.85 or something. And yes, I know I left the Romanian out. I just thought you'd prefer a change in scenery. It even has the lightning cut, like a late style SKS. But no cleaning rod. And of course the gas system is different. Very similar front sight, but it's obviously inspired by the Lungman, not the SKS, and it does have a 1,000-meter rear sight like an SKS, but it's a different pattern, again based on the Lungman. It even has a threaded barrel, threaded 14x1 left hand like an AK, whereas an SKS, by standard, has a non-threaded barrel. Overall, it weighs slightly more than an SKS and is slightly longer, but it still has a 20.5-inch barrel. So, very similar. These are actually really fun guns. Very interesting piece of history. And really shows the time when the SKS, along with the Hakim, that's what Egypt had. But it's a brief little blip. I just thought we would show it. But now, you know, the SKS is associated with Russia, sure. But there's one nation that it's probably much more associated with, and rightfully so. It's really the nation where it found a home. So it's time to talk about China. Obviously, anyone who's done much with SKS is really, this is what you think of. Because this is what we've had in America for the longest time. In fact, the earliest SKSs were bringbacks from Vietnam. Some were Russian, some were others, but many were Chinese. And then in the 80s, we got a lot of them running through the 90s. Russian SKSs would come in, others as well, but so many were made there for such a long production run. And while we do know a lot about them, based on the examples we have here, there's still a ton of mystery. Even where they were built, numbers, how long. So, I'll tell you what I know or think I know, or at least what I've heard, and we'll go from there. And this one is my early example. And early on, like everything else, it looks like a late-style Russian. Really, it's the same time period we're talking about, 1955, 1956, which explains why China adopts this as the Type 56 carbine. Not to be confused with the Type 56 rifle, i.e. assault rifle, which is, of course, their Kalashnikov. And the earliest guns are the Sino-Soviet, which are basically these, just assembled in China. They even have Tula star-marked receivers. Then you have the quote-unquote ghost guns, which don't have any real factory marking. These seem to be late 56, 57 in that time period. And then you get the factory 26 code marking, which is the Jianshe, Jianshe factory, which is our primary producer of the Type 56 for China. And this is where we'll mostly see production from for the next decade or so. But it would spread out. Nevertheless, in this time period, we are still using some Russian components. Some of the first to change over would be the furniture, because it's easy to mill wood, or in this case, Bakelite, because my early gun here is in the so-called jungle stock. This is a kind of fiberglass, or some people want to call it Bakelite stock. Good for humid climates. But it still has a spike bayonet, a blade bayonet, Russian style. Same, nearly 12 inches length. Interchangeable parts. Just more and more things being made in China over the time. Up through about 1959, 1960, 1961. Now, relations between Russia and China had always been rocky. They'd get kind of chilly, then thaw, then chilly. And while there was a bit of a thaw in the mid-late 50s, by the early 60s, it's getting rough again. And this seems to be when Type 56 production is relying on Chinese machined receivers, made barrels, and all that stuff. It also explains why production rates maybe are a little lower in this time period, but also why we start to see some changes. And I will say again, the more traditional way of making an SKS really played into China's favor, because for decades, various Chinese arsenals, factories, warlords had been producing, usually without license, copies of European guns like the broom-handled Mauser all throughout the region using traditional machining, milling equipment. So, while they had the AK as well, the SKS was well suited to them, and Factory 26 was still the primary builder. And now with Russia out of the way, we start to see some Chinese changes. And here's my later example from my collection. And you'll notice this sling swivel on the side here. This is one of the earliest things we see. In fact, these would appear on guns dating back to the late 50s, although it's always possible they could have been restocked. And they'll move it around a few times. They'll move it back to the bottom in the mid-60s, although, like my gun here, they appear with the side. Either way, let's just say you start to see either side or base-mounted swivels, because I know we did a carbine, the magazine fed the Type 84, if you want to call it that, video years ago when I had one, and it had the side swivel. So, yeah, it's kind of a unique Chinese placement, though. And, of course, they use their own type of wood, which is pretty neat. And we of course get the unique Chinese spike bayonet, the pig sticker. Kind of ironic that the earliest Russian guns had a not dissimilar spike, although it was a different pattern, and the Chinese would go back to it. Although you still do see some blade guns come out. There's really no rules, because they make these for a lot of nations, not just their own, and contracts vary, parts vary, manufacturers vary. Lots of things vary. In fact, we were talking about Egypt a minute ago. In the 60s, China would send several thousand Type 56 carbines to Egypt. No one knows exactly how many, but it could be almost 50,000. Probably not that high, but it could potentially be that high. And it really shows you that by 63, 64, production is up and running again at full rate, and they're really making these guns the way they want them. The bayonet's the big identifier, but you do start to see some production expediencies and economies appear around 65, 66. For example, we would go from the milled trigger guard, trigger group system here, for that matter with the serrations on the safety, to a stamped pattern here. You can see the step down here, the stamping evidence of the trigger guard coming in. Also, the safety loses its patterning. Just a way to save a little time and energy. They would also go to a different style of gas block. Faster to machine. They would eventually go to a two-piece gas tube as well. Faster to make. And they would eliminate lightning cuts, which would just kind of eliminate machining steps. For example, bolt carrier on the original, not on this one here. On the bayonet lug housing, that's going to get simplified, not too dissimilar from an early Russian. They even removed the cut on the rear sight, right here, a little slot down the middle. Yeah, they'll get rid of it. Why not? You know? They don't really need it. And you'll notice we go from the sort of long lug barrel shank to this short style here. Check it out. And that's because, as they switched away from the original Type 56 AK to the stamped receiver version, they went from a screw-in barrel to a press and pin in for the AK, and eventually this would come into the SKS production Type 56 line as well. You know, they would go to pressed and pinned in barrels. I don't know exactly when, probably different factories, different times, but this started to be visible in the 70s for sure. There's lots of other little changes besides that just make these really interesting. Speaking of interesting, here's an interesting part that appeared in the mid or late 70s. Meet the French tickler upper handguard. This is a bakelite or fiberglass material, and you'd think it would go with the fiberglass stocks, and you could, although this has the smooth original style. But a lot of times when we see these, they're actually combined with a wood stock. It's just cheaper and easier to do, better heat dissipation, it's got some texturing to it. Just one of those later style changes. I just have one here in my parts bin. I'm sure I'll put it on a gun one day, but it's a unique little part, and it does seem to be relatively late production, which makes sense if you look at their Type 56 AK production line. This is the era when they're developing the Type 56-2, and that was the bakelite side folding guns. So yeah, they're trying to do that for a lot of production reasons. And SKS production at this point in China, the Factory 26 guns were pretty much through the 60s, but around 70, it seems to spread out to more and more factories. We see more factory codes and symbols, some large factories, some small, and this is probably to free up capacity at 26 for other projects, although they still would make some. But we really don't know for sure. But with different factories making these guns, and of course we have different contracts, different exports. We have essentially unmarked guns just for serials. We have fully marked Chinese guns. It's also at this point when this is really longer a frontline Chinese gun, although they would still use them, because in the 70s China was going through a good amount of turmoil, and a lot of projects got postponed for years, not just guns, but other military equipment like fighter jets. This is also why the Type 56-2 took so long to come out, so much so that the Type 81 eventually took its place, which itself was kind of an odd hybrid between an AK and an SKS, but I digress. There was also the interesting Type 63, which was essentially an SKS with a rotating bolt, magazine-fed, 20 rounds, I believe, and a select fire SKS type gun. Again, they really ran with this, and it really worked well for them. They even, at least briefly, experimented with a stamped receiver. I don't believe the Chinese military ever used a stamped gun, but we saw some come over here in the 80s. It's an interesting thing. They're actually quite rare, but I'm not sure exactly how good they are, but, it's a rarity factor type thing. Just thought I'd mention it. And then there's all kinds of variants that they really made for the American market. The so-called paratrooper with the 16-inch barrel. That wasn't a Chinese military gun. That was them just taking a standard gun, chopping the barrel from 20 to 16, and usually chopping the bayonet down to correspond. The pre-ban guns all had full-length gas systems. In the post-ban era, so, 92, 93, they would do a short carbine-length version as well. And, of course, they had several versions like the SKSD, the SKSM, that Type 84 or T84 we did a video on that took AK mags. Some unmodded mags, some like the 84 modified. Again, while these might have been inspired by things like the Type 63 select fire gun, they weren't direct clones or copies. That was just China, making stuff for the American market. For example, Clayco was importing SKSs in 1984. We see those. And really in 88, the floodgates are open. Lots of people bringing these in. Some are ex-military guns. Some are quote-unquote newly made, even if they're on maybe scrubbed receivers. Who knows? Parts can be anything. And, everything. Mix and match this and that. And these would continue to come in until the ban on rifle bore Chinese guns in April of 1994. So, many came over. They were very inexpensive. Some in great shape, brand new. Some were well used. How many SKSs did China make? Millions. More detail than that? Who knows? I think the estimate of 10 million is maybe a little high, but if you tell me they made over 5 million, I'd believe that, considering they produced them. The Jiangxi arsenal would make them up to about 1980. Other arsenals would make them and refurb them. And not just content to make guns for their own use and sell guns to other nations like Egypt, they wanted to get in kind of the same game as Russia, setting up production in other nations to further spread the Type 56 love. Back here to talk about my two Chinese. These are both ones I think I always knew I wanted. The early one, well, I always wanted a so-called Bakelite stock, a jungle stock, fiberglass stock. And this one even does have the correct wire-ended sling instead of leather, or faux leather. And most of the stocks like this were cut for the blade bayonet. You can find some that were cut for the spike, but a lot of those were actually modified. And for a long time in America, you could actually pick up these stocks and magazines for little or nothing. So it was a spare part sold. But the actual guns are quite interesting because they often have not all that many markings and probably were destined for export to other nations. Mine here came from my friend that I got a lot of my Japanese from, and I really like it. It's cool to see a Bakelite stocked gun. I think it's really neat that they even found a way to integrate the cleaning kit compartment to the stock. And that's just China really making the SKS its own. It might have started in Russia, but if the SKS is identified with one nation only, it has to be China, frankly. And if you're going to have a Chinese SKS, yeah, having the Bakelite stock's cool, but you have to have one with the pig sticker, the spike bayonet. It's a must. And if you're going to do that, what I looked for seeking this gun out was one that had most, if not all, the later production features. Like we already talked about, the stamped trigger guard, lack of lightning cuts, and the pinned-in versus screwed-in barrel. I wouldn't mind finding a stamped receiver gun. I just haven't run across one yet. And to be fair, I don't believe the Chinese army itself used many, if any, of the stamped guns. I think that was more kind of a commercial thing. And that also explains why I don't have a paratrooper. That was something made for the U.S. Are they cool? Yeah. They're also really handy. And the little shortened spike bayonet's adorable. That T-84, I was sorely tempted to keep. But it came with 4 or 5 serial match mags, and it was worth too much to other people. And since it wasn't based on a military configuration, and since it was a little finicky, I'm not going to lie, it wasn't as reliable, and it was a little weird to load. Yeah, I let it go, and honestly, I don't regret it. I don't have to keep, and don't even want to keep everything. I like picking my favorites. And I'm very happy with both of these. And it took me a while to kind of find Chinese SKSs that I was all about. I've had a ton of these come through my hands. Some very cool configurations. I've had several friends over the years that are really into the Chinese SKSs. Excuse me, I think I might have said AK. At this point, I've been talking a while, so you get it. Still storming outside, although it's kind of moving away. But no, you have to. And the quality of the Chinese is every bit as good as Russian. The only ones that might be a little questionable, some of the 90s post imports that were either the purely commercial ones, even if they run, are of less interest to me. I like the military. I even like the newer ones that have come in from third-party nations that are a little rough. Well, some of them quite rough, but they're honest. They're military guns, and that's what I really enjoy. The commercial ones that are perfectly blued, that's cool and all, but it loses something. And then earlier we talked about the Russian guns getting the TAPCO or ATI stock treatment. Oh boy, if the Russians got it bad, the Chinese got it worse. Oh my God. So many Chinese guns were butchered. A lot of them too were shot with corrosive ammo and rusted out. So it's really, really sad given that 94 we had the ban on guns directly from China. But at least in the last 10 years or so, we've had Type 56 SKSs come in from other places. So I really do like them. I just like variations. It's always fun. And China SKSs definitely have that in spades. Next, we have to talk about two variants that are every bit as rare, at least in the USA, as the East German Karabiner-S. So, don't have any to show you, but oh well. First, let's talk about the North Korean Type 63. Recently did a video looking at the Type 68 parts kit, their stamped AK, and also talked quite a bit about their Type 58. It might be kind of counterintuitive that they would actually start up SKS production in North Korea after milled AK. But they did. Probably just reasons. Why not? It's North Korea. We know basically nothing about these because, well, how could we? The only ones in America are Vietnam bringback, maybe a couple that have filtered in through other sources, but there are not very many in America. How few? Honestly, probably under 50. Now, they do seem to be more based on Russian. At least we know that the Type 58 in North Korea was primarily, the production line was set up with Russian help, so it would stand to reason that the Type 63 would also be more leaning towards Russia versus Chinese, but I could be wrong in that. We also know that there is a grenade launching variant with a pretty simplistic lever put on the gas block to shut off the system for grenade launching, and then it has the detaching grenade launcher spigot that goes on the barrel. So it's a two-piece system. There are also reports of a variant with a side-folding bayonet. So take that for what you will. We don't know where they were built, how long they were built, how many were built. We don't know much of anything. And I don't believe that North Korea exported many at all. Maybe a handful to other Southeast Asian nations when they didn't need them. But, yeah, that's the North Korean Type 63. And that lets them join the ranks of the relatively small number of Simonov carbine manufacturers. Now we have our early Chinese out to talk about the North Vietnamese Type 1. We know more about this one, which is kind of funny, but there we go. Like I said, there was a split between Russia and China around 1960, give or take. You can actually see this in MiG fighter production, too, with the way things go. Either way, China wanted to kind of become the dominant force in the region, not Russia. So they started actively looking for other nations to help set up production in themselves. And North Vietnam was a ready example. So they started talking about setting up a factory there, actually quite near Hanoi, to build all kinds of things. Small arms, pistols, rifles, machine guns, ammunition, even larger artillery, plus refurbishing, restoring existing guns for the military. So China would send over tooling, blueprints, and even experts to help. And this started around 1961, which kind of froze the SKS example, the Type 56 example, around that era. That's why I left the blade bayonet one out. And by 1962, the factory was up and running and ready to go, and they started turning out their first Type 1 SKSs. But, much like the Sino-Soviets from 1956, were Russian parts assembled in China, the Type 1s were Chinese parts assembled in North Vietnam. And much like with some later guns like the Ghost guns, we do start to see more and more domestically made wood furniture, but probably not much else aside from maybe some small parts. The plan was to switch over, over a few year period. But of course, we're in the 1963 now, and the French are getting out and they're gone, but now Americans are getting their nose in it. 64, Americans start to really come in, and 65, the American presence is well felt. And this would very quickly disrupt production at Factory 1 of the Type 1. The reason it was called Factory 1 is because this is kind of China's first effort at exporting their production. So that was pretty much it. It was destroyed during various bombing attacks as part of American operations. I think, namely, the first Rolling Thunder hit it pretty good. Again, it's relatively near Hanoi, so that makes sense. Factory's damaged. Production is kind of taken offline, and won't really resume until the mid to late 70s once the American-Vietnam War is over. The Type 1 looks like this, well, except Woodstock, of course. And it has a star with a 1 in it. That's its unique identifiable feature. I believe the serial numbers were all 6-digit. And that's about it. Pretty much a Chinese-assembled gun in North Vietnam. How many were built? According to the SKS boards, and also Forgotten Weapons, based on the SKS boards, 6,000-ish, maybe. So, not a large number. There you go. But it's worth kind of crediting it for it. The Type 1 is a valid variant, and a handful are in America today. Are there more of those, or the Type 63s? Who knows? It's harder to tell the Type 1s because of how many Chinese parts are in them. Actually, some even show up with Russian parts. So, maybe they came from China. Maybe they were leftover Russian parts that China filtered over. Maybe Russia sent some. Maybe they were built from cannibalized other guns. Who knows? But you can find a mix of parts with probably only the buttstock being Vietnamese origin, but even that could be questioned. But yeah, they do, as far as I know, all have the blade bayonet off the spike, but I could be wrong. I'm not an expert on these. But two interesting variants. Don't have them. Hard to find. What do you do? Probably never will get them. And this would not be the end of China's efforts to export their influence around the world. In fact, let's kind of bring it back west, back towards Europe. Alright, we have the spiker back out because it's time to talk about the Type 56 in Albania. And what a story it is. It should be pointed out that, yes, in 1994, Chinese rifles were banned, and for quite a long while we never saw Chinese SKSs on our market. But then some years back, they started to appear again. And the part of that reason is they were in a third-party country, and once they're there long enough, they can be declared as that as a country of origin instead of China. And the majority of these came out of Albania because it was a major user of the Type 56 rifle and carbine, for that matter. And why is that? Well, oh boy. Well, Albania's communist leader, Hoxha, he was a staunch traditional Marxist, meaning he was just a dick. He put the dick in dictator, let's just be honest. In fact, Tito in Yugoslavia was too liberal for him. Remember, Yugoslavia was kind of towing the line, trying to be communist, of course, but it was an independent communist movement from Stalinist Russia, the Third World, India, all that stuff. Nope. But he liked Stalin, Hoxha did. Stalin was the kind of old-fashioned tyrant he could get behind. So Albania and Russia were tight. But then Stalin died in 1953, and there was a couple of years of power struggle in Russia. But then Khrushchev came in, and there was a process of de-Stalinization there, and Hoxha felt Russia, the USSR, was becoming too liberal. But, Mao in China, he's an old-school person from that era. So relations between Albania and China open up because both of them feel jilted by the USSR. And things really seem to progress around 1960, 1961. And the first thing that China does is they send weapons to Albania, including Type 56s like this. And then soon, in 1962, Mao agrees to help establish factories in Albania, and the same process we kind of saw in Vietnam starts there, transferring tooling, technology, blueprints, and so on and so forth. And it would take a little time, but in 1966, a new factory would open its doors. Known as the Umgrange Arsenal, it would produce this fine example of a SKS carbine, one of the most unique ones too. What's its name? I rightly don't know. We call it the Albanian SKS. Some call it the July 10th rifle, saying that's independence for Albania. No, Independence Day is actually November, so that seems to be a misnomer. I've also seen Type 56-1 or T56-1 mentioned for it. I've never been able to verify that either. Whatever, Albanian SKS works. And at first it might seem like a copy of the Chinese, but it's one of those things where it immediately doesn't quite feel right. Like I said, the factory would be finishing up in 66, and it would turn out its first SKS carbines in 1967, but we're talking very small numbers, under 1,000 this first year. But the next year wouldn't have a whole lot more, but then we would get to a pretty big production period between 69 and 71, where they would turn out just under 3,000 a year. Not a huge number still, but yeah. And they're still receiving Type 56s from China directly. And you'll even find hybrids where they'll mix parts, mix and match. And, well, it was more successful than China's efforts in Vietnam, right? So what makes this so different? And I guess I would argue the most unique SKS, maybe? Beginning with the rear swivel, this is clearly Chinese-inspired. Moving forward, we have a late-style machine trigger guard, not the stamped. Then we have an odd magazine. It's just different. I don't know why. It just is. It's got a more gentle curve to it. It's more humpy. Maybe it was an improvement. Maybe it was just how their factory produced it. But it is distinctive, that's for sure. Now this still has the groove cut down the rear sight. And the forearm, you're looking at it thinking something's not quite right. It has a spike bayonet, but then you get to the handguard. And it's interesting. It's longer. The handguard's extended out with 3 slots and larger. Yeah, kind of interesting. And of course the forearm is extended out to match it. Basically we just don't have this gap up here. It covers almost the entire gas tube, which is actually a good idea, frankly. And if you go back and look at the Simonov, the SKS 41 prototype, it has a similar handguard. I'm sure it's just a coincidence, but I like the look of the handguard on this. It's different. Also kind of harkens to Yugoslavian production of their AKs. Of course, the buttstock has a different cleaning kit system. 1 hole in the Chinese, 2 holes in the Albanian. 1 for the cleaning kit, 1 for a solvent/oil bottle. As far as I know, it's the only SKS that has 2 trapdoors in the stock instead of 1. Let's flip them over and deploy the pig sticker bayonets. And they look very, very similar. The Albanian does have a lightning cut bayonet housing, but it is shorter. The Chinese, roughly speaking, is 1 foot long. This, roughly speaking, is 11 inches. And you can see the difference when you flip them over and look at the underside of the stock. The trench for this to go into comes all the way to the magazine on the Chinese. And if we look at the Albanian, we have a decent little gap of wood there. Also the underside of that unique magazine. Why they did this, I have no idea. Oh well. They had their reasons, I am sure. Just as with this cocking handle, charging handle. The Albanian has a very unique handle, kind of AK-shaped. It could be said that this was just easier to machine than the SKS style, true. A little heavier. It could also be said that they were always planning to produce the Type 56 assault rifle, the Chinese AK, and maybe they wanted a similar charging system just for troops familiarization. Maybe both. Either way, it's a easy to identify part on the gun. And the quality of these, the bluing and woodwork, can be all over the place. Some are very nice, some are pretty haphazard. The wood, for example, is, as far as I know, usually beech wood. But different stuff has appeared over the years. And in some ways we have more production information about the Albanian than we do the Chinese. For one thing, they did at least date them, or at least most of them. There are a few hundred examples without dates. We don't really know where they're from. But another weird thing is there's a gap. After production really ramped up between 69 and 71, it seems to have stopped between 72 and 75. At least no examples have turned up. Maybe the undated ones are from there, maybe they're early, maybe they're late, we don't know. Why? Could be a lot of reasons. For one, like I said, they were tooling up to make the Type 56. They call it the Ash 78. It was put into production in 1978, and actually has remained Albania's standard issue rifle up until the modern era when it's finally being replaced by the Beretta ARX 160. But that could be it. It's also possible they were just getting guns from China, Type 56s. They might have thought it was just better, because again, their rate of production was low. So maybe they thought it was more economical to just import them from China instead of building them. So why would they actually start back up? Because they did. They began production of the SKS in Albania again in 1976 for another run. So the Albanian. I've had a few in my life. And actually, it's how I met my friend that I did the trade with the Ishesk for the Tula with, and several other guns you've seen throughout the years in my collection. I had an Albanian I was selling, and he wanted it. In my little hometown, there weren't that many people that knew what an Albanian SKS was, much less, to pay for them. Now, these always were a little spindier than the rest. And sometimes they were in either rough shape, or even if the guns themselves were in good shape, the machining, I don't know, the Albanian machining, some years they were really nicely done, other years they're kind of rough. But it may be my favorite variant, just because of how many changes they made. Everyone else is kind of sticking to the plan, not Albania. And for just how long they actively use them. There are reports of these things still being deployed with police or some other kind of non-frontline military units into the 21st century. And the fact that they're so rare today. I mean, with such a low initial production number and then so many destroyed later on. Really the most in the world are right here in the US of A. And they did. I don't know what they're going for now. I can't really speak to it. But they've appeared on and off over the years. I've had a couple. And I like this one. I'm actually very happy with the one I ended up with. It's nearly perfect for my needs. I don't think I'll be upgrading it. You never know. There might be a really even nice one coming along. But it's not something I added to my collection until I kind of had more of an advanced collection, because I don't have any other Albanian guns. So it kind of stands alone. Although it does kind of sit nicely with the Chinese, because they're definitely, if not siblings, certainly cousins, if second cousins maybe. But no, they're really cool. Would I buy one as a shooter? No, I would not. It's definitely a collectible, and I think these are always kind of intended to be collectibles here. That's just a weird, rare gun. If you want to shoot one similar, get yourself a nice Chinese. They will serve you well. But the history behind the Albanians is actually really cool, including the crazy dictator that basically led these being adopted. And actually, with that, let's return. Back to story time with Hoxha. You know, Mao would die, and gasp, now China is becoming too liberal and becoming too cozy with the West in the 1970s. And he doesn't like this. And he distanced himself from them, and in 1978, the split's final and complete. So, who knows? This would actually start a pretty tragic period in Albania of severe isolationism because he couldn't find anyone else, quote-unquote, conservative enough, i.e. Marxist enough, hardcore, for his liking, meaning that up until his death in '85, it was a very lonely place, and this really hurt the nation economically even more than it had been under communism. And they would have to wait another half-decade before finally in 1991 there was a revolution. So, just thought I'd share that. Back to the SKS, the first year back in production, 1976, was a very low rate, like a couple of hundred. 77 was also quite low rate, under 1,000, I think around 500. But then in, 77. Then in 78, we had the biggest year of production ever, nearly 5,000. So almost half of these ever made were made in 1978, or at least dated 1978. And then there seems to be one more year, fewer than 1,000 made, 1979. Those numbers plus the unlisted one gets us a total roughly of 17 to 18,000 produced. Meaning not a large number. Not at all. So by all rights, this should be a rare gun. And it became even rarer when 10,000 or more were destroyed following the war in the Balkans, the Yugoslavian Civil War, all that. And to kind of appease NATO, the UN, all that, they agreed to destroy a good chunk of their old military hardware. And the Albanian SKS kind of got lumped in with that. So more than half were toasted, plus, several hundred or thousand have been lost over the years through attrition. But we're lucky, because pretty much all the surviving Albanian SKSs found their way to America. There's more here than in Albania now, by a long margin, and so they probably were saved from being destroyed themselves. How many are in America? No one really knows. Estimates are 5,000 to 6,000. So it's a rare gun in the grand sense. Not that many more were made of these than the Vietnamese ones, but because over a third were saved and sent here, or roughly a third I should say, and collectors got them, and they weren't cut up because they were never select fire. The fact that they were semi-automatic only SKSs meant that they could be unmolested. Now, I have seen some that got imported where they cut the bayonet off. I don't know why. Could have been something an individual did because they were stupid. Could have been something that an importer did for some reason. But most of them you find are in interesting condition. Some are nice, some are rough, well used. Some have some Chinese Type 56 parts. You can also find some Albanian imported Chinese Type 56s with some Albanian SKS parts on them. It's an interesting thing. And it's quite possibly one of my favorite SKSs. Maybe because it's just so different. I have a Chinese sling on this one. You find them with those. There's also an Albanian sling that was made domestically that appears on them. They use whatever. Again, both guns served concurrently, so not a big deal. And Albania had many more Chinese guns than they did domestically made guns. So, you know, FYI there. Now, it is one of my favorites because it's so unique and special. So with that, now that we're back in Europe, which nation should we visit next? Well, we're going to move further into Europe, or back to more central, because we're going to talk about Czechoslovakia and the VZ52. Now, this is in no way, shape, or form an SKS, but you know what? It's part of the story, even part about resisting Soviet domination, and, after all, we did include the VZ58 in the AK deep dive video, and I just want to talk about it, so why not? So, actually one of my favorite guns in terms of just interest, although I can criticize its design for a few things. Obviously, Czechoslovakia was overran and dominated by the Nazis throughout World War II. Thus, after the war, they were mostly influenced by German small arms, the K98. Of course, they've made the VZ24, and in some automatic terms, the G43, the K43. They also took note of the American M1 Garand. And immediately after the war, the communists didn't have a firm hold yet. In 1946, they wanted to have a new infantry rifle, self-loading, 5 or 10 round capacity. And at first they wanted a full power cartridge, so they could have long range. But eventually, people prevailed on the generals, the old guard, to let intermediate cartridges into the trials. So in late 1946 this happened, and in 1947 the first Czech intermediate cartridges appear. And these are not based on the Russian M43. They might seem similar only because both were inspired by 8mm Kurz from Germany, and of course 30 caliber carbine out of the US. So kind of same origin. And one of the earliest cartridges was actually known as 7.5 by 55. And this would be changed down to 7.5 by 45. And the early prototype was known as the 49-3. And similar to this. But right around the same time, the communists really were getting their claws into things. And to kind of conform with the rest of the Soviet bloc at the time, they changed from 7.5 to 7.62, which, okay, makes sense. Kind of a standard 30 cal. So this is kind of their first effort to comply, but also continue doing their own thing, including with their own rifle design. So they had 7.62 by 45. This led to the model of 1950, the 502 prototype. The Army suggested a few changes and updates. This would result in the model of 1952, which was adopted in March of that year, which is what we have right here. Really is an interesting gun. The gas system is an annular piston that actually goes around the barrel, kind of taken from the MKB-42 out of Germany. The trigger is like an M1 Garand, especially the safety style. The recoil spring comes from hell. Sorry, but anyone who's ever tried to put one of these back together, you know what I mean. The buttstock is very beefy and thick. And we have a side-folding blade bayonet. Now, this is the second pattern. The original, well, actually the third pattern. The original gun actually had a spiker. The Army wanted to change this, so they went to the first blade pattern. They liked it, but they wanted something lighter. So this is the lightened blade, and I don't blame them. While this gun has the same barrel, 20.5 inches as an SKS, and the overall length is actually slightly shorter, like 39.5 inches. The overall weight, even with this lightened bayonet, is over 9 pounds. So heavier than the SKS. And part of it's just the system. Oh, and this has a tilting bolt system, but it tilts in the front, not the back, which is just bizarre. But, you know, they're doing their own thing. And it does feed from detaching 10-round mags, and they even issued 2 with the gun. 1 in it, and 1 in this handy little cool belt pouch. So that was there for a quick reload. But that was kind of like with the Lee Enfield. I'm sure that's what inspired them. You know, the British Enfield would be issued with 2 mags, at least initially, before stripper clips were a thing. The second one for an emergency if someone got in a heavy firefight. Otherwise, they were expected to top it off with what the British called chargers. So this too was cut for stripper clips. Unlike the SKS, which had a 10-round clip, this actually had 2 small 5-round clips. So on some ways, it was slower to reload. Of course, you could partially reload it with 5-rounders. And on other ways, they're easier to transport. You could get, you know, they weren't as tall, bulky. Yeah, take it for what it is. And it seems like the stocks were either made of walnut or beechwood. And the original guns had a phosphate finish. And again, they were chambered for 7.62 by 45. They were put into production in 1952 and would have a straight run until 1956. And they would build about 150,000 of these, and it would have a pretty limited frontline use. There were a few reasons for this. For one, while it was a good gun, it was relatively expensive. It was a little heavy, like I said, and it is a bit of a bear, as I've already mentioned, to not so much disassemble, but reassemble. And it has kind of the whole trigger group and the stock thing with the hinge trigger guard that the M1 Grand M14 has, which can have some interesting consequences for accuracy. So not a perfect design, but it was very much a Czech design, as was its cartridge. And this is where the Soviets objected. The Russians would have very much preferred that the Czechs adopt their rifle and their cartridge. It benefited them politically and economically. But since this was well underway, before the communists even took thorough charge, they didn't have much of a chance. But still, they started putting some pressure in 1954. In fact, by this time, Czechoslovakia, unfortunately for them, is becoming quite a firm satellite state. And there's an interesting arms deal with kind of Russia playing matchmaker, but where Egypt actually receives quite a bit of ammunition and quite a few of these rifles, yeah, the VZ-52, from Czechoslovakia, amongst other things, going to Egypt. And Russia's sending SKSs, they're sending VZ-52s. But there's a problem. This fires a non-standard cartridge. Well, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact is formally signed, and part of that is all the member nations have to have a common cartridge. Well, this might seem kind of, not good for the Czechs, but on the other hand, NATO does the same thing. Standardization, if not guns, at least cartridges, does make sense. So that's why the production was suspended for the VZ-52 the following year. It might have happened faster, except it took Russia a good bit of time to get the M43 cartridge specs over to Czechoslovakia so that they could begin producing the cartridges. Some sources also claim that the SKS served in the Czechoslovakian army. I cannot find anything to verify this, but it wouldn't shock me if the Russians did send a few over for pattern testing and whatnot to kind of compare. But it was never an official service gun. But they would have to adapt their gun to fire the Soviet standard round. Enter one of my honestly prized possessions, the Czech VZ-52-57. This is not a whole lot more than a reworked, rechambered VZ-52. Now, they never took VZ-52 rifles and barreled them for the new cartridge. These were purpose-built from the factory. Now, maybe did they use partially completed receivers or things to build these? It's possible, but there are some critical differences we will talk about. For one, obviously the magazine shape is different. This is more angular for the cartridge, 39 versus 45. The stocks could be interchanged, but the 57s tend to have more of a baked-on paint finish, something that'll be carried over to the 58. They also have a pressed and pinned-in barrel versus a screw-in barrel, which is just one of those economies. And one actual benefit, this has a non-chromed bore, this has a chromed bore. And they're both threaded for a blank fire device. And because they felt like the 7.62x39 cartridge would not be as accurate as far out as 7.62x45, they went from a 1,000-meter rear sight to a 900-meter rear sight. And they also changed the cleaning kit that's in the buttstock. So, yeah. Actually, I have to move over to the other side to talk about the Zor 52. It's just kind of where things sit. This is where I put some of my older battle rifle types. I don't know. Again, we find places in our collections in the rooms where they fit. A friend of mine built this for me a long time ago. The VZ52s are just neat. You know, it has me thinking, when I started collecting, the reason, I mean, I love history, but the reason I got into milsurp was you could just go into a store and pick up most guns, and really it was just pocket money. It was the kind of money you would have blown that night going out to dinner in the bar or whatever. When I bought my VZ52 pistol, it was $50 in the store. Yeah, I know, economy, that's more like, you know, $150 in today's money, but still. That's how I bought my first VZ52. Now, it wasn't the one we've been looking at in the video. It was the old school truck bed liner one. And I did shoot it. And 7.62x45 is a lot of fun. Unfortunately, the ammo, even back then, was getting a little unreliable. And over time, the primers get less and less stable. Which is why I ended up wanting a 52-57 like a lot of people. And it was a bit of a whale gun of mine. I knew about it for a long time, but I had to wait many a year to find one in any condition. Luckily, sorry guys, just trying to move around a bit. Luckily, the ones that seem to be in America, the 57s, are usually in good shape. A lot of them came back from Grenada, whereas a lot of 52s did as well. Many were also imports. So, yeah. But I eventually found it. I think it was came from a gentleman, a collector out in California. I can't remember if for some reason it was no longer legal there or if he was just getting out of the business. But, yeah. Now the extra magazines and the pouches for them I actually got from a different friend. Actually, the one who built this gun. I don't know, everything has memories. But they're neat. I love how Czech guns are just kind of their own deal. And they really kept on with that trend. It certainly fits in here in spirit with the Russian, but it also with the M1 Grands down there. Of course, the BM59's one of my favorites. I don't know, it's all just fun, guys. Even after doing this for decades, I still get a great deal of pleasure out of it. But I'll be honest, I would find it hard to collect, starting off with today and today's prices, guys. So, and if you've noticed, most everything we've looked at, once in a while I'll buy something online. Most of the stuff I have was either a local pickup, or if it came from another state, it was through a friend. I don't know. Just kind of how I go. I'm often content just to know what I want and just wait for it to come my way. But, yeah, the VZ52 and the VZ52-57, very interesting guns mechanically, but be aware spare parts are not gettable, and yeah. I would be reluctant to shoot the 52 with much original ammo. I'm not sure if anyone's doing replica ammo or not. Only this gun and then the machine gun, the VZ52 light machine gun, fired it. So even though it was a very good cartridge, very long-ranged, quite flat shooting. In a lot of ways, it was superior to 7.62x39, but it never had a chance, unfortunately. Kind of reminds me of, the British intermediate cartridge. They got steamrolled by 30 light rifle 308 7.62 NATO. That was NATO. That was the Warsaw Pact, and that's just kind of how things were. Alrighty, let's go back to the table. Here's the SKS 10-round clip again, and here is a Czech BZ52 or 52-57 5-round clip. See how much smaller it is? It does have a very gentle curve to it, but not like this. Again, I get it. So it is a different setup. And here it is partially in. I'm not going to risk putting it in all the way, because with only one hand here, I don't want to risk it slamming forward, because I'm in my house. But, yeah, you can understand how it might be easier, although slower, to use two 5-rounders versus the big 10. And they are different widths, so they're not interchangeable. And just for fun, here is the bayonet deployed. Yes, there's no cleaning rod under the barrel. It is actually a sectional rod stored in the rather generous buttstock compartment, very much inspired by the M1 Grand. So in no way, shape, or form an SKS, not even using the same clips, but because of Soviet Warsaw Pact insistence to conform, they would have to redo it. Same thing happened with their submachine gun. It's just kind of sad because this was already going to be an interim gun. They were already very much working on what would become the VZ58, but they would put these in production in 1957 and build them until 1959. Roughly 100,000 were produced. So they were in frontline service in Czechoslovakia very briefly. Total of 250,000 of the two models. They would be exported to a few places. Like I said, Egypt would definitely get the 52, and I do believe they did get some 52, 57s as well, but I could be wrong. Some would make it to Vietnam, but Cuba is probably the largest official user outside of Czechoslovakia. They would officially adopt the VZ52, also acquiring some VZ52, 57s. And, of course, they would make their way down to Grenada, which is where a lot of U.S. soldiers would come across them, and we would actually end up with a good number of greenbacks from that war. In fact, most of the 52, 57s you find can be Grenadian greenbacks, although there was at least one batch of imports from Century. Now, the 52s, those are more often Century imports, and you can definitely tell the ones that have the truck bed liner put on the stock, that was totally done by Century. If you see one with truck bed liner, it definitely was a Century import. So be aware of that. Also be aware that the ammunition X45 is very corrosive. The bores were not chrome lined, so you can find some guns that externally look awesome, and then the bores are sewer pipes. And a lot of the times the front sight is missing. The hood and retaining spring for the nut are all one piece. They just go on. So sometimes that piece can be missing. It's a really interesting gun. It's analogous to the SKS, and much like how the SKS only was in frontline Russian service briefly, well, this was in frontline Czechoslovakian service briefly. Of course, then they adopted the excellent VZ58, which was much lighter and quite a bit shorter. kind of goes to show you. But I always enjoy talking Czech guns. And with that, we have one more SKS manufacturer, and it's a big one, and it's a very important one to U.S. collectors today. Saving the best for last? Maybe. maybe not. But saving the most popular, or the one that might interest the most people for last, I think so. Zastava, or at least what we know as the factory of Zastava today. And that's because they've made quite a name for themselves with Zastava USA and their M70 series, but also because this is the most recent batch or wave of SKSs to come in. You know, originally we had some Vietnam bringbacks, but the SKS along with the 7.62x39 cartridge was very uncommon in America in the 70s. The 80s and early 90s, well, those are ruled by the Chinese. Russian guns started coming in the mid-90s, but it was relatively brief. And other guns like the Romanian, the Albanian, too small in numbers to really make a giant influence. But after the end of the Yugoslavian Civil War, after that nation broke apart, we started receiving a lot of SKSs from that nation. And luckily, they could actually come in even during the assault weapons ban, so before the end of 2004. And since then, they've been coming in large numbers, too. So that's part of the reason people really like them, because they've been gettable and reasonably affordable, and are of good, high quality. So, we're going to begin with the original right here. Within Yugoslavia, this was nicknamed the Papovka. That's because PAP, P-A-P, is essentially semi-automatic rifle. Their AK was the AP, for automatic rifle, essentially. And as you can see here, getting a lot of mileage out of our early Russian, or our late Russian. It's basically, again, almost an exact copy, although there are some differences we'll talk about. This is the M59. Now, that should tell you something. It was adopted in 1959. Okay, Russia was wanting better relations with Yugoslavia, and they actually just gave them the SKS production line. It wasn't as generous as all that. I mean, by 1958, 59, what good was it? They tried marketing it in 1955, 56. The nations that would bite did. The ones that wouldn't didn't. So they essentially gave Yugoslavia the production line. It's kind of a goodwill gesture. And it worked out well for them because they had already been wanting a self-loading or select fire rifle to replace their M48 Mauser as well as other older Mausers, the 2447, 2452, etc., etc. So it was selected for service in 1959, and the assembly line was set up in 1960, and an early pre-production batch of a few hundred was conducted in 1961. But then there would not actually be any Yugoslavian PAP M59s made for the next couple of years. It would not be until 1964 that full production would begin. And this first batch would run through about 1967. So, pretty standard SKS. Interestingly, it does not have the lightning cut on the bayonet housing. Otherwise, looks pretty well the same. I will say that the way Yugoslavia numbered these is a little different. Typically, these M59s are in the B or C prefix serial block, and they also would use assembly numbers. You'll see kind of the -0 codes on these in different places. They have a blued finish, 20.5-inch barrel, although early on there were some quote-unquote long barrel models produced with a slightly, longer 22-inch barrel. But full production was, standard here. Not much to say about it, except one thing, and the probably most famously known thing. The bores are not chrome-plated. No one knows exactly why they made this decision, but the idea that Yugoslavia did not have chromium is not true. In fact, some member states like Macedonia had chromium mines, and there are even points in history where Yugoslavia exported chrome to other nations, so they had access to it. Why didn't they? Maybe for accuracy? Maybe because their 7.62x39 ammo they produced was brass-cased? I don't know. Another interesting thing, the bayonets they used have more of a dull finish. They did not give it the shiny plating. It's more of the dull metal. And the wood early on was usually walnut. We'll also see some elm and beech used, and it's possible there's also some birch in the mix. There were rumors for years about teak wood, but that's all they were, rumors. Most people say they probably mistook it for elm, but they did use multiple types of wood. And best number I can find for the M59 was over 50,000. But again, really only 2 serial blocks, because it was a stepping stone. Obviously, by even 1964, much less 1967, this is looking pretty dated. And this is when Zastava is working on its own Kalashnikov variant. But really, it would not be adopted until 1970, so they have to make do with this for a while. And if you know anything about Yugoslavian Kalashnikovs, you know that they have grenade launchers, infantry rifle grenades. And that's just something that Yugoslavia seemed to really like. And, well, of course the SKS would get it too. Enter the PAP M5966. And to this point, the only other SKS we've seen with the grenade launcher cutoff and grenade launcher spigot was that one variant of the North Korean Type 63. But it was different. It had a very simplistic switch on the block and a removable grenade attachment. This is a fixed grenade attachment. Ironically, the overall length is about 44 inches. But part of that does include this thick rubber recoil pad, which adds, I don't know, half an inch. So it's about 3 inches-ish, 3.5 inches longer out front here for our grenade. Of course, our sight, it's all kind of together. Our spacing. Notice we move it back quite a bit. Yeah. Kind of makes me wonder if this is why they did those two long barrels as a test run, just because preparing for this. And interestingly, these are 22mm grenade spigots for launching standard NATO spec rifle grenades. Again, Yugoslavia is nominally third world and not formally part of the Warsaw Pact. It really does make Yugoslavian history quite fascinating in this time period. So back here, the rifle, aside from the butt plate, is quite unchanged. But this device, yeah, it's pretty well thought out for what it is. You can tell they seriously wanted rifle grenades. You have to push the gas cutoff on, then you can lift up your grenade sight and launch your grenades. And this was actually really smart, because while other SKSs would be of pretty limited utility for most militaries by the 1970s, this let the M5966 have a certain role. It could be a grenade launcher, and therefore it has a purpose. And, you know, we did that video on the Polish KBKGWZ 1960 recently, and it's kind of the same thing. It was the only milk gun they kept in production and service while the others were retired. And this lets the average infantryman be quite effective. And here are the bayonets deployed to show you that they had to go to a different pattern of blade. It's longer to compensate for this. You can really see it back here with the fuller groove. And of course this goes all the way around the muzzle. This can't, it actually is just a small lip that locks on to the bottom of the launcher there. Not as secure, but frankly it's not something they probably figured the soldiers would be using that much. but it does mean it does have a unique bayonet housing. And they would keep the 59-66 into production, at least main production, to 1970. That's when the AK would join the lineup, or I should say the AP. However, it seems to be in limited production, at least for export or maybe refurbishment, through the 70s and even up to 1989, which is pretty much the end of Yugoslavia. It's hard to know. Also, numbers are hard to know, although roughly 250,000. At least 160, 170 were for the 1,000, were for the Yugoslavia, and then roughly 100,000 were for export customers to kind of go around the world. And again, we see various wood types and what have you. We have one other variant to talk about as well. Referring back to the Yugoslavian Sim 70 AK, like I said, if anyone knows it, they know it has the grenade launcher. Also, you know it has night sights, either tritium or phosphorescent paint. Well, the M59-66A1 was a variant that also came with night sights. You've got very much the same style on the rear here as we have on our AK. Folds down for night use. And then, of course, you have a folding front as well. So, in a lot of ways, I think of this as about the most advanced SKS we've seen. We have a grenade launcher, we have night sights, we even have a rubber recoil pad. Not to say it's advanced, but you know what I mean. It's about as modern as we're going to get. And it did get quite a bit of service and attention over the decades. And our last visit here with the Zastava, the Yugo. The M59-66 I bought new from Century Arms. It would have been, I think, early 2004. They had them, and you could buy very kind of grades, good, very good, excellent, and they had what they called unissued. I popped for the unissued. Other people I knew went for the excellent, and while the condition of the gun wasn't really that different, what I noticed is the unissueds came with all the accessories, whereas the other ones sometimes didn't come with much of anything. It was much more potluck. And they also came with a boatload of Cosmoline. That wonderful, thick Yugoslavian Cosmoline that smells like a melted crayon. So that was fun. And what was cool about this gun when I got it was the fact that you had a bayonet, grenade launcher, grenade sights, things that we couldn't have on more modern guns because it was still the assault weapons ban. Tail end, but still there. These were legal because they were considered CNR because the nation of Yugoslavia no longer existed. And these have been coming in for a couple of years at this point, but they were still quite new to the market. And since the importer had a lot to bring in, yeah, conditions started off very, very nice. And the 59-66 was definitely the more common, or the 59-66A1, 6-1 half dozen another. And I've had this gun ever since that. I guess coming up on 20 years. I've also never fired it. I took the Cosmoline off the outside, but things like the gas block still have it in them. I never probably will shoot it. I also once got my finger stuck in the butt plate because of the rubber butt pad with the hole in it for the trap door. Trust me, you can do it. Don't believe me? Try it, and then you'll believe me. Didn't so much hurt, but it was hard to get off my finger. That's one of my biggest memories about it. Of course, around the same time, you could also get Yugoslavian M48s, M48A1s, or A's, I should say, in similar condition. And that's something I've been fortunate to witness, because in the 90s, the Yugoslavian Civil War was happening. The Zastava stuff has only really started to come in the last 20 years or less. And I was already actively buying surplus and AKs by that point, so I was able to watch it all come in. Good fun. Now my M59 here came from my same collector friend. I actually had these come in around, I don't know, 2013, 2012 from Century. They had a small batch of M59s listed as excellent condition. It's always been a much rarer variant compared to the 66. And I had him, he wanted two. There were two different stock woods, so he got one of each type. I considered keeping one back then, but again, it looks very, very similar to other guns. Money was tight for me, so I didn't. And then a couple of years ago, he was selling off his stuff, and he brought one of these over to me. Wanted to get rid of it. I took it, and I fully intended to go ahead and list it online, sell it. I never did. I just didn't really feel like it. You know, kind of thought I'll do it tomorrow. And I just hung on to it. You know, one day, maybe it'll go. I mean, it is very similar to my Romanian and my Russian. But it's also kind of unique, kind of special. Not super rare like the Albanian. But, yeah, I just don't feel any reason to sell it. And it holds a place in the collection. It too has Cosmoline in it. He never shot it. It didn't come with any accessories, it's just the gun. But I guess what's nice about both of these is I know they're in the same condition as when the importer brought them in, and that no doofus has, run corrosive ammunition or otherwise abused or swapped out parts. I know both of these guns are 100% correct, at least correct based on when they left the foreign country. But now the Yugo guns are really nice, and they have given a whole other generation who missed out on the Russian and the Chinese an opportunity. And since they are quite common, and since many of them are in great shape, these are excellent shooter candidates. Just make sure you clean the bolt Cosmoline out real good so you don't have sticky firing pin. The bluing's really nice on them, and I really like the wood variations. It has a kind of neat texture to it. But the grenade launching, all that stuff, it's just cool. Eons ago, I did handle one North Korean, but we're talking back before I even really knew what it was. And I probably never had a chance to buy it even then. I kind of regret not getting a North Korean, not yet. I definitely wish I had an East German. But I'm going to be honest, I don't really miss a North Vietnamese, or at least, Vietnamese now. I don't know. It's basically just a Chinese gun. Some cool markings, some cool provenance. If they were relatively inexpensive, sure, I'd want one. But other people want them more than I do, and therefore, they should have them. With that, let's go back to the table one more time, then we'll wrap this here deep dive up. The M59 itself was only in frontline Yugoslavian service for a few years. After that, they were either put into storage or given away to allies, sold off. Some also claim that some went back to the arsenal and were rebuilt as 5966s. I can't confirm or deny this. I can say that the 66 model stayed around much longer. Again, rifle grenade launching. It also would be ending up in the hands of reservists, second-line troops, some militia units, and yes, they were used sometimes for some very dark things during the Yugoslavian Civil War in the 1990s. You can run across these with some trench art and things on them, but yeah. Plus, again, they did export them. In fact, a good number were exported to South Africa, where insurgents use these, especially their grenade launchers, very effectively against armored vehicles and the like, on columns and such. So, they also have some infamy in parts of Africa, or acclaim, depending on which side of it you're on. But either way, the grenade launcher feature was very much drawn upon. And then, of course, they became famous in America as these started to come over as the Chinese and then the Russian guns dried up here We had a couple of years of SKS drought, and then these started appearing. Some of them are well used, including their bores. Again, not being chrome lined, they could be quite ragged. Others were in unissued condition, and so looked really good. It's of course worth pointing out that even if a gun looks good externally, always check the bore in the gas block, especially with the grenade launching ones. Some of them, this lever got corroded. It doesn't want to move. You actually have to press it in to rotate, so it won't rotate accidentally. And because of corrosive primers and all the salts and rust that form, that can get frozen in place if not cleaned properly. So even if the outside looks good, that can happen. But yeah, they were good little buys. They had the slings. Obviously, this one has the later Yugo sling they used on their AK. Cleaning kit and all that. They actually came with quite a bit of cool accoutrement. And yeah, with at least 500,000 built, that doesn't mean it's a huge number, but you know, more than Romania, most likely more than East Germany, definitely more than Vietnam. We have no idea about North Korea. Not at all. Certainly fewer than Russia, and definitely fewer than China. So Yugoslavian guns kind of fall right in the middle as far as production. I mean, 250,000 plus is no small number, to be sure. So, a lot of us own these, and they're very, very neat. So what do you think? Let's go back, and I'll give some final thoughts, and we'll wrap up this here deep dive. And we've come to the end. I'm back over here. One little fun story about the VZ52, the original, the first time I saw the one that had the trap bed liner. I thought, what the shit's this? It was just on the rack at the gun shop, and I could tell that it wasn't an SKS, but it was kind of that era. The trap bed liner really threw me off. And because back then you could just do it, I picked it up out of curiosity. Luckily, the gun shop actually had the ammo too. I paid about $125 for the gun, so a little more than an SKS would have gone for. And then the ammo was quite affordable for the surplus stuff. That's why I still have stripper clips for these. So that one, of course, the bore wasn't great. The trip bed liner made it look awful. And there was really no prayer of removing it. But I've had a few others over the years. And this is a pretty good, nice example. Not perfect, but quite nice. Now, the 57, I'm just thankful to have it, especially having a spare mag. I have a spare mag for each, because they are different mags. And I have a later style sling on the 57 as well. But just thought I'd share that real quick, because you know me, I really like my Czech guns. But let's go back over to the SKSs specifically. And the lights are going out, so welcome to my dark world. Whoa. Hey, this is how I see the world. Also, our storm is passing, and I'm tired now. But tired in a good way. This was fun to do. I've been wanting to do an SKS guide for a while, and with the encouragement from several of you viewers, it was a good reason to do it. As I said at the beginning, there's a poll over on Patreon. You can vote for the next ridiculous deep dive. And if you haven't seen it, there's a frankly quite fun uncut version of a Patreon Q&A 25 we just recently posted as well. Hopefully, again, this is Misha from the past when this video goes up, but hopefully Fox and I are getting some R&R done. And we will be back very soon as the heat breaks. We have several guns we're looking forward to shooting, and hopefully quite a bit of new content for you all. We will wrap up some ongoing reviews like with the Pioneer gun, some Zastavas and what have yous. But the SKS, it was very, very underappreciated for a number of years, and it makes me happy that it's getting recognition, and also happy that people no longer put horrible stocks and goofy, unreliable extended mags on these. To be fair, though, in the 1990s, during the assault weapons ban, people were kind of forced into it. If you couldn't afford or didn't already have a pre-94 gun, well, you could pick up an SKS, which by its very nature would be. And if companies are offering all this stuff, folding stocks and whatnot, it was a way to do it, and do it quite cheaply. So, I understand. I don't like it. Even back then, it was horrible, but I do understand why they did it. So, yep. But now, unfortunately, prices are quite high on any SKS. But at least that does kind of keep Bubba away. Bubba likes them cheap, or free, and dirty. Typically, I think an SKS has roughly 6 serial matching parts, at least stamp matching, and a few more can be E-pinned. Your Russian guns, most of them are going to be refurbs. Chinese guns are all over the place. Romanians, a lot of those came in mismatched just because of their nature. Yugos, they should be matching, but you also have a second set of numbers that are kind of lot numbers or assembly numbers. Like I said, it has like 0 dash blah 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 in them. So that's not the serial, so don't worry about when you see that. As far as shooting them, well, the firing pin we've already talked about. Make sure it's clean, make sure you're safe. Make sure you have some good stripper clips. They are reusable, but the original intent was to make them disposable. So, buy a big old bag of them. Generally, they will work in all the standard guns, but once in a while you'll have a clip that just doesn't want to fit a particular gun. It's just how it goes. As far as slings, they're pretty standard. Some of these originally would have had Mosin slings on them. Some of them had SKS specific slings, and a lot of them just shared a sling with the AK because they were produced concurrently. But the cleaning kits and the buttstock, no, those were specific to the SKS. And generally, parts will interchange, especially amongst like Russian and Romanian. Yugos can get a little different when you get to the grenade launcher. Chinese, kind of the same, just depends on which variant. And Albanians, well, they're their own critter. Anyway, yeah. That's actually starting to rain again. I thought it was kind of passing. Oh well. Hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the SKS. Had a lot of fun making it. Very tired, so probably get a good night's sleep here. If you haven't, check out my previous ridiculous deep dive onto the Kalashnikov, the AK. And, these are fun to do once in a while. I mean, not every week, but the nice thing is about on YouTube, when there's a long video, just save it in your watch list. Watch 30 minutes here, 30 minutes there. Just pretend like it's on Netflix or Hulu and you're watching a season. Say what you will, but I think my Season 8 will be better than Game of Thrones. Alrighty, guys. If you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, go over to Patreon. This is Misha, and we'll be back from vacation, catching you with some new content very soon. Have a good night.